Alrighty, let's get started, chat. 19 Roy 50 Stare. Welcome to another Healthy Gamer GG stream. My name is Alok Kanoja. Just a reminder that although I'm a psychiatrist, nothing we discuss on stream today is intended to be taken as medical advice. Everything is for educational or entertainment purposes only. If y'all have a concern or question, please go see a licensed professional. I see we have a hype train running right now, level 1. Thank y'all very much. We really appreciate it. Appreciate all the subs, donations, Twitch Prime subs, etc. It supports the work we do. It helps us build resources, helps fund our research, things like that. So we're really, really grateful for that. Thank you to everyone who supports the stream. Nice. 13-month streak for Erdeadilol. Erdead. My favorite thing about this is trying to decipher the names. Oh my goodness. I see that we're already diving into gender dynamics in an unhealthy way, but that's okay. We're going to get into that. So a couple of other things just to touch on before we get into stream today. So we're going to be talking a little bit about masculinity today. I think it's something that is important to discuss, and we're going to talk about it sort of in the way that we usually do, which is that we're going to share sort of perspectives, some of which are based in research, but today we're going to deviate a little bit more from research. The other thing that we're going to do today that I think is incredibly, incredibly important is we're going to talk a little bit about how to survive in an unhealthy family. And I think this is a topic that not only does it not get enough attention, I think it doesn't really get any attention. So if you look at sort of the way that we discuss family dynamics on the internet, there's always like an independent perspective, right? So someone will post about, oh, like my parents are helicopter parents. And then it's sort of like, oh, you should get out of there. You know, like, oh, like so-and-so, like my brother is addicted to video games and never leaves the house. Oh, like you should stop supporting him. There's a very, very like independent kind of like, oh, here's the problem, just cut out your family and just GTFO. That's sort of the attitude on the internet that I tend to see. I don't really see much about if your family is toxic, like how to engage with them. And this is where a lot of people will say like, oh, engaging with a toxic family is a complete waste of time. Whereas I think part of the reason that people come to that conclusion is it may be true for them, is that I don't think we're actually ever taught like how to build bridges, right? So then what happens is that, anyway, we'll get into that. So it may be a little bit of a weird topic, like in the sense that I imagine that half of the people who are watching won't really resonate with it at all. And at the same time, it's like the other group of people who are really in toxic family situations where it's not so easy to just leave. Where like, how do you engage your family? Like what are the methods that you can use to try to like get people to do things? So yeah, it's tough, man. I think it's like the internet, I think sometimes doesn't appreciate how tied up we are with people that we're bonded to in some way, right? So people will be like, oh, just like break up with them and move on. Just break up with them and move on. Just break up with them and move on. And that, I'm not saying that that's bad advice. I'm just saying that there's another side to that, which is like, if you love your family and you're not willing to abandon them, how do you engage with them? Okay. Does that make sense? Yeah, so Harry Wario saying the ones that can build bridges don't make threads in Reddit. You only hear about the toxic cases. That's a huge point, right? So I think that there's a big selection bias on the internet, especially when it comes to things like gender dynamic discussions and things like that. Yeah. Okay. I don't love them, but I can't abandon them, as rock and roll is saying. Yeah, so that's like, so even if you don't love them and you're not willing to abandon them, like, what do you do in that situation, right? So we're going to basically have a talk about equipping the people who decided to stay. And like, the internet is all about trying to get you to leave, right? It's not about trying to help you if you decide to stay. Couple other things. Are we going to get a clue today? Ooh, not that I know of. Crow Gold. If there are clues, I don't know. I don't know them. Okay. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about masculinity. Is that the clue? No, genuinely. This is not a clue. It's not some next level thing. We gave y'all a clue last Friday, but I don't know the stuff either. So Tickle My Pikachu says, let's go. I don't know exactly what part of the body a Pikachu is. We're assuming it's a part of the body. I guess it could be just the Pokemon that you are accompanied with. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about masculinity. So let's take a quick look at a post. Okay. Dr. K, what is healthy masculinity? I think social media right now is being flooded with unhealthy masculinity, specifically YouTube Shorts and TikTok. I would really like a video for young men that explains what healthy masculinity is. Second, to that Dr. K's community, what do you think healthy masculinity looks like / is? So let's actually start with this. What do y'all think constitutes healthy masculinity? Right? What do y'all think is healthy? So we have Assassin Llama 23 saying, I'd say read Meditations of Marcus Aurelius to learn what healthy masculinity is. Okay. So one of the most famous Stoics. Being based, it's hard to explain. It's subjective. Beating people up, deadlifting pizzas, stoicism and chivalry, discipline, strength and courage, strength and self-control, healthy ego, being dependable, being one with your emotions, bros supporting bros, stoicism, responsibility, protective and kind, be secure in your identity, being alpha and wrecking betas, just being human. T-pose without fear, body health, courage, strength, responsible, being a provider, bravely accepting weakness, bring back chivalry, provision, responsibility, resilience, considerate leadership, being pragmatic, leadership and composure, following your dreams, confidence, responsibility, high testosterone. All great possibilities, right? Being top rank in League of Legends. So I'm going to share some thoughts today about what I consider healthy masculinity. But before we even get into that, I think we need to understand historically what masculinity is and what's going on right now that has essentially caused somewhat of a crisis within masculinity. So let's start with and this is going to be largely the sources of the information that I'm going to share are largely going to be my own kind of personal experience, anecdotal observations, and clinical experience. A lot of what I'm going to be sharing is not actually going to come from peer-reviewed studies. So that's kind of like a big disclaimer at the beginning, but I will share some really interesting data from here to support a couple of points. But generally speaking, the thesis of this is based on Dr. K's experience as opposed to, tons of well-established studies. So let's start with historically what masculinity was. And I sort of would break this down into masculinity traditionally was the 3 Ps. So being a protector, being a provider, and being a patriarch. So if we look at like anthropology and the study of like human civilization over time, what we tend to find is that most cultures were very, very tribal, right? So it's like a group of people. And because cultures were tribal and we had a bunch of people, we had a division of labor, or maybe the other way around. The necessity of division of labor, like, so there were hunting skills, and then there's like, you know, turning milk into cheese and butter and things like that. There was so much labor intensity that humans basically had to band together to be able to get everything done. And the human beings that were able to band together to get everything done, the ones that were able to maintain, for example, dairy cows and farm land and go out hunting, those were the ones who essentially like performed the best, right? So there was an evolutionary advantage for a division of labor. And so things basically broke apart along gender lines. And whether that's sort of like scientifically a good idea or bad idea, I can't really comment on that. That's just sort of what we observe, right? And so what men were traditionally responsible for is protection. So even today, for example, in the United States military, if you're a man, you can get drafted. If you're a woman, you can't. I'm not trying to turn this into a discussion about men's rights versus women's rights or whatever. I'm just saying that this is sort of a legacy of what historically has been a responsibility of men, is to be protectors. So warriors, people who fought in battles, things like that have historically been men. The next thing is to be providers. So there's sort of this idea that, especially if you go back 100 years ago, you know, there's sort of like, there are these very traditional gender roles where like women sort of stay in the household and men go out and they earn. And so maybe about 100 years ago, you had a lot of households that were single income earners, okay? Maybe 60 years ago, 70 years ago. And so that sort of worked back then. So men have traditionally been providers. They used to go hunt, then they would like earn money, right? Once we moved to a money-based economy. And so that's sort of like a general idea, is like a man provides for their family. And this is where I'd love to share kind of an interesting experience I had as a clinician. So I was working in a jail, and there was a 18-year-old kid there. And we were talking a little bit about how they ended up in jail and things like that. And he was in jail again for selling drugs. And when I sort of talked to him a little bit about, like, you know, what's up with that? How did you get into selling drugs? Why do you sell drugs? What does it do for you? And his primary reason for selling drugs, at least as how he explained it to me, is that, well, like, I have 2 older sisters, and they've like told me ever since I was a young age that a man provides. And so like I have to provide for them. So like, and the only way that I can kind of do that, or the only way I can figure out how to do that, is through selling drugs. Now, I'm not saying sharing this story is sort of an indictment of women, and maybe his older sisters weren't the nicest people. Maybe he could have been lying. That could have been his perception. I'm not trying to make an overall comment on men good, men women. I mean, men victims, women bad. What I'm pointing out is that traditionally what we've sort of seen is that men feel the responsibility to provide, okay? Whether that's right or wrong, we'll get to that in a second. The third thing is that men have traditionally been patriarchs. So what does that sort of mean? That means that in a lot of societies, the family unit is patriarchal, which means sort of the man makes decisions, is head of the household, et cetera. I think that some of those masculine ideals are more about being leaders, right? So like offering guidance and wisdom and things like that. And so these were sort of traditional gender roles. As me, as a lay person, I'm not saying these are factually accurate. This is just like, I was trying to figure out when I saw this question, okay, like when I grew up, what were sort of the ideals of manhood that I experienced? And furthermore, seemed to be consistent with the other men that I worked with, both clinically as well as like, you know, in my social life and things like that. And this is sort of what I could come up with, right? So men are providers, they're protectors, and they're patriarchs. And so what's happened over the last, let's say, 20 years, 50 years, 500 years, 1,000 years? So the first big thing that's happened is that we've become, as human beings, more independent. So we used to be like, you know, tribes that required a division of labor for everything to function. But as technology has improved, we've no longer needed to be quite as dependent on each other. So, you know, let's say 500 years ago, there may have been like one cooking pot for the whole village. And everyone goes out, forages, we all get together, we make everything together, and we sort of like spread the resources, share the wealth and whatnot. As technology improves, we no longer need to do that, right? So I no longer need to milk my own cows. I no longer need to churn my own butter. I no longer need to bake my own bread. I can go to a grocery store. I can just get all those things. I have things like a stove, right? So I don't need to start a fire. I have an oven. I have this thing called a microwave. So I actually don't, like, you can completely subsist off of freezers and microwavable food. You know, you don't need any kind of specialized labor to be able to eat anymore. So what we're sort of seeing is that as human beings become more independent, they're becoming less communal. And as we become less communal, some of those traditional gender roles or like some kind of labor divisions across the community, the family unit, whatever, have sort of become less important because we don't really need to do those things anymore. And things have become so independent, right? So, and then 50, 60 years ago, we had a lot of gender equality. There have been historically gender equality throughout, you know, the majority of human history. And so as we're sort of moving more towards equality between all people, we're sort of seeing a systemic shift in terms of what men are doing, in terms of what women are doing. And I think generally speaking, that's really, really good, right? So as we're sort of getting equality between the genders, what's sort of almost happening is there's a crisis of gender roles. So even if you look at, and this isn't just for masculinity, there's a lot of change and morphing in terms of like what it means to be a woman, right? So for a while, what it meant to be a woman was to be a homemaker, and that's what we defined as femininity. And then what happened is like women became more independent. We sort of changed the way we sort of conceptualize femininity. I'm not saying that femininity is perfect by any means. I'm not saying that there aren't toxic variants of that as well. But there's been sort of like a revival of what it means to be a woman. And so then at this point, I think actually it's in a pretty good place where I'm sort of happy that we live in a society where for the most part, a woman, I'd hope this is true. If this isn't true, please educate me. But this is what I think would be a wonderful target, is that, you know, a woman can essentially decide like, okay, if I want to be a homemaker, that's just as laudable as having a career. And that it's not like we're valuing one over the other. Now, I think what's kind of interesting is as we have this kind of equality that's growing, as we're seeing more independence, we're starting to see certain challenges for people who hold traditional masculine roles. So the first thing that's happening, and I think this is purely economic, is that the number of single income households is decreasing. So this is like, it's a huge problem because now essentially if you want to survive, many people have to be dual income households because you just can't support a family. You can't buy a house, go on vacation, and raise 2 kids with a single salary. Now, why this could be affecting men disproportionately is because I think that if you actually look at research, and this is where we're going to cite a particular and interesting study, is that men, I don't think, even though it's harder to be a solo provider as a man, I don't think that societal attitudes have kept up with the changes in equality. So what I mean by that is that as things have become more equal, I think we haven't started to judge men in the same way. So we sort of linger with older judgments towards men, even though men are trying to exist in a society where like what the responsibilities of a man are no longer like as capable to be able to be done, if that sort of makes sense. Maybe a simpler way to put that is we still expect men to be men in a society where it's becoming increasingly difficult to do so, i.e. being a single income earner. So a good example of this is actually if you kind of look at attitudes towards dating and dating men in terms of like what people prefer. So the really interesting thing is that 80% of people will say that a man should be able to provide for the household. Now, before we start like bashing women, oh my God, like women, this is society as a whole. So the other really interesting thing to understand about damaging gender attitudes, and this is true, I think, of both men and women, is that a lot of the damaging attitudes towards men or women are actually perpetrated by men and women. So I've also, another piece of anecdotal experience, I've done some work in finance. And the really interesting thing is that I've worked with a lot of women in finance, and women in finance are treated very, very harshly for getting pregnant. So there's almost this unspoken rule, which thankfully is changing, and this could be a slice of my experience, but if you're a woman in finance, I'd be really surprised to hear that you don't know what I'm talking about. But essentially, like what women are told is that like you can't have a kid until you get to a certain level professionally. Like the earliest you could potentially have a kid is 32. And the really fascinating thing is that this kind of feedback about when women can have children does not usually come from men. It actually usually comes from women, at least in terms of my experience of working with women in finance. So this is what happens. Like, you join an investment bank or a private equity firm. It's 80% men and 20% women. So the powers that be decide, right? Oh, like, here's a woman. So let's do this. Let's set up a mentor who is the other woman in our company. And so we oftentimes see very like intentional mentor-mentee relationships created between women in finance. And then what happens is that your mentor, who's like in their mid-40s, takes you out to lunch and says, oh, by the way, like, you know, they'll sort of have these kinds of conversations and they'll say, hey, you know, it's really not a good idea. You'd be destroying your career if you decided to have a baby at the age of 25 or 26. I had to wait until I had my first kid at 36. And since I had to do it, you have to do it too. And so it's kind of interesting because what we're starting to see is that like a lot of these attitudes that are actually perpetrated by the gender themselves. And this isn't about sort of men versus women. And especially if you look at the idea of being financially independent, men feel that way just as strongly as women do. Now, in terms of dating preferences, we also tend to see that while most people really expect men to be able to like run a household. And that's where, you know, if you take issue with that, I would encourage you to sort of think about that for a little bit, right? So if you're a man and you take issue with that, think a little bit about how okay are you? Could you feel healthy about yourself? Could you be proud of yourself if you were a stay-at-home dad? Or do you feel like some amount of your value as a human being, your value as a man, comes from being financially independent and being able to take care of a household? If you're a woman and you say, oh, that's really unfair, you know, that's not an issue. We're not like that. So we can't generalize all women, first of all. And the second thing is I would encourage you to look around, not only in terms of your own relationships, but if you are in a committed long-term relationship, you know, how much money does your partner earn, assuming they're a man? And also look around at your social circle and look at what are, you know, in terms of like who your female friends have decided to date, how many of them are, as we put it, deadbeat men versus men who have careers and make money and things like that. So I encourage y'all to just like look at this, right? We're not saying that something is necessarily good or bad. We're just trying to understand the historical perspective of how we got here. So I think part of what we're sort of seeing, and this is what leads to a crisis of masculinity, is that we're expecting particular things for men. It's becoming harder and harder for men to fulfill those things. And then what happens is we have this overcompensation in other masculine characteristics. So since I can't support a household just by my solo income, which is probably due to inflation more than anything else, then what's going to happen is I have to, like, my masculinity leans into other aspects, right? So we'll have like these very, very like overt masculine forms because we can't like check some of the boxes. I don't know how to be a patriarch. I can't be a provider. So like I'm going to lean into being a protector, right? So you'll see a lot of like very kind of like aggressiveness amongst men. And what I've sort of noticed is that the hypertrophy of masculine characteristics, whether it's hypersexuality, you know, dominance kind of language, like even in terms of appearance, the more hypertrophic of particular masculine characteristics there are, I've seen an overwhelming amount of insecurity about other masculine characteristics. And so it's like the more macho of a man I become, that relates to my insecurity in other dimensions. I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to provide. I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to be a patriarch. I don't know if I can be a protector. And so almost to compensate for that, what I tend to do is inflate other aspects of masculinity. And this is where I think a lot of men are struggling because there are other kinds of systemic issues at play. So for example, about 1 out of 4 households is a single parent household. About 80% of single parent households, at least in the United States, are women. And so what we're also sort of seeing is, as we've seen, by the way, the trend is increasing in terms of single parent households. I think in 2007, it was maybe 12%. In 2017, it was maybe 16%. So it's kind of going up in terms of like the number of single parent households. And so what we're sort of seeing, I think, is also a lack of healthy role models for men, right? So as we're sort of seeing more and more men not having healthy male role models who can teach them what healthy masculinity is, and we'll get to that in a second, what we sort of end up with is people who are trying to figure it out on their own. And as we start trying to figure it out on their own, what we end up with is some adaptations that end up being maladaptations. So a good example of this is like independence. So one of the, the male virtues, and we'll get to how most of these virtues are not really male towards the end. One of the male virtues is to be independent, right? I should be able to take care of myself. And so I think that part of what happens over time is as we kind of lean into this, I need to be independent, I need to be independent, I need to be independent. What this sort of turns into as a maladaptation is like being closed off from other people. So what we tend to see is that men are conditioned to only feel anger. So that's the only socially acceptable feeling. So I remember, for example, when my dad passed away, like if I started crying, like men would walk up to me and they'd say like, be strong. And I interpreted that. No one told me what that meant. They didn't explicitly say, stop crying. They just said, be strong. Now is the time for you to be strong. I didn't know what that meant. I still don't know what that means, right? What does it mean to be strong? But the way that I interpreted that is to not display negative emotion. And even when I remember kind of growing up, like it's okay to get angry at stuff, right? It's okay to feel frustrated. It's not okay to be ashamed. It's not okay to be afraid. It's not okay to be worried, right? Like those are the kinds of feelings that we're sort of not conditioned to feel. And so as we sort of rely on independence, what we end up doing is we sort of like adapt to that, right? So I'm told I need to be independent. And if I'm told I need to be independent, how do I do that? I end up numbing myself. I end up being out of touch with my emotions. I end up not leaning on other people for emotional support, right? Because that's like independent. It's not manly to start crying, put your head on someone's shoulder and cry. Like that's not manly at all. And so we have some of these perceptions of what masculinity is, and we try to adapt to them, right? So we try to lean into this ideal of independence. And as a result, we end up actually creating a maladaptation, which is sort of emotional like numbness and emotional withdrawal from other people. And so this is essentially what I think is going on with masculinity right now, that there have been traditional masculine gender roles, and some of those gender roles have been hard to achieve for men as society has changed. The other tricky thing is that I think that society's expectations of men have not kept pace with what is actually possible for men. So for example, as more and more women enter the workforce, the idea that a man may not be able to provide hasn't really kept pace. And when I say that, once again, that's not an indictment of women, because remember that these are societal expectations and men themselves feel this way as well. So this is where like, if you're a stay-at-home dad, you're much more likely to be judged by other men than you are to be judged by women. Actually, I don't know if that statement is statistically true, but I would imagine so, right? So there's just an assumption. Like when I'm meeting other dads at the playground, there's an assumption that all of us have jobs. So they'll just ask me like the second question, what kind of work do you do? There's an assumption. Whereas if you meet moms at the playground, there isn't an assumption that they work. So a lot of these attitudes are sort of legacies. Society hasn't really kept pace with what it's like to actually be a man. And we tend to be judged unfairly, in my opinion, for that. Once again, just because men are judged unfairly doesn't mean that women aren't judged unfairly too. We're just going to sort of focus on this question, which is what is healthy masculinity? And so let's get to that. So what would I consider healthy masculinity? So I tend to think about healthy masculinity as embodying two major traits. One is to be independent and one is to be responsible. And this is where we've got to be careful, because independence doesn't necessarily mean not having connections with other people. So let's talk a little bit about what I mean by independence. So at the top of the list is hygiene. So this means that a man, in my opinion, should be able to groom themselves and be cleaned. Also have a place that is hygienic. So to be able to do your own laundry, keep your place clean, not have, have a clean toilet, have a clean bathroom, have clean laundry, be able to clean the kitchen. It means to be able to do all of those things, to have a clean life and a clean living space. And this is where there are some, gender attitudes that still persist, that men aren't supposed to clean and cleaning is women's work. So in my opinion, a man should be independent and shouldn't have to rely on anyone to clean their house. Second thing, so men should also be in that way self-sufficient, right? So you should be able to cook for yourself. You should be able to do things around the house if you need to. It's okay to have some division of labor if you're in a committed relationship. But if you're asking me what would I consider being a good man? I would say it's being able to handle stuff kind of on your own. It doesn't mean that you necessarily have to. The next thing is to be responsible. And so that sort of means a certain amount of financial responsibility. If you decide, once again, with your partner that you are not going to be earning money, I think that's actually totally fine. But that's still, in my opinion, a financially responsible decision, right? You're sitting down with your partner, you guys are having a discussion about it, and you're sort of concluding, okay, you're going to focus on your career, I'm going to focus on taking care of the kids, taking care of the house, and like that's actually totally fine. I think a certain amount of responsibility also includes self-care. So this is where I think a lot of men actually trip up, that taking care of your emotions is part of self-care. It's not just physical health, but mental health that is your responsibility. So even if you struggle with something like depression or a generalized anxiety disorder or bipolar disorder, I don't think it necessarily makes you weak to have those things, in the same way that you could have been born with, a collagen deficiency, or born with, if you hurt your leg growing up, you have to take care of that, right? So you should be responsible for your mental health. I think another aspect of responsibility is, to a certain degree, being responsible for the people around you, right? So accepting some amount of responsibility. And so I think it's essentially to be like independent and responsible. Does that mean you need to be able to pay all of your own bills? I think not necessarily. Because the other thing you have to do as part of that responsibility, a healthy amount of responsibility, is to acknowledge the limits of your responsibility. And this is where I think we slip into some amount of toxic masculinity. And if you ask me, what does toxic masculinity mean? It means taking traditionally male ideals and growing them, having so much hypertrophy in those ideals to where they start to become maladaptive or harmful. So it's fine to be independent. I think being independent is a wonderful ideal. And yet, if we grow that value of independence all the way to the moon, what we end up is men who are isolated. So in essence, what I consider as healthy masculinity is like to be independent and to be responsible, to take care of your health, take care of your hygiene, try to be as financially independent as possible, try to be, a self-sufficient human being who makes the world a slightly better place. Now, if you're listening to this, and especially if you're a woman, you may think, oh my God, but those are not those aren't masculine ideals. Like, I as a woman can do this as well, right? Those are great. And I would completely agree with you. So I think as we are sort of seeing more and more equality, as we're seeing less division of labor, I can be a man or a woman today and be completely independent, right? I can have my own place. I can have my own job. I can contribute to my retirement. I can have a doctor. I can have health insurance. I can have a microwave. I can just completely take care of myself. And so I think the other thing, and this is what I honestly believe about masculinity and femininity, is that if you really lean into these yogic teachings, right, these teachings from the karmic traditions, that these things, which a lot of people will agree with, are social constructs, right? They're constructs of the mind. And at the end of the day, I think being a good man or being a good woman doesn't necessarily have different criteria. I think the real thing is to be a good human being. And if there are certain aspects of your identity that you appreciate, whether they're masculine or feminine, by all means, lean into those. But at the end of the day, I don't think that healthy masculinity is substantially different from healthy femininity. I think that word healthy doesn't actually come from the masculine or the feminine. The word healthy comes from the humanness that we all share. So to be independent, to be responsible, I think is ultimately the essence of healthy masculinity. Remember that as we're kind of summing up, I think that when we get tripped up is when we start to lean into certain aspects of traditional masculinity and we kind of use them as substitutes for, not being able to fulfill particular insecurities. So if, for example, I don't feel very good about being financially independent, what I'm going to end up doing is comparing my penis size to the size of other people, right? I'm overcompensating. And I use that example kind of intentionally because that's literally what we see. We see a lot of hyper masculine or toxic masculine behaviors come out of an insecurity about being able to fulfill other aspects of what I consider to be masculine. So if you want to be a healthy man, I'd say, first of all, just be a healthy human being. Secondly, be a little bit aware of what does society expect you to be and what of society's expectations have you internalized for yourself. And then be critical of those and ask yourself, okay, which of these am I willing to take on and which of these am I not willing to take on? And this is where things get really tricky because if you abandon some of those societal norms, there's a very good chance that some people out there will judge you for it, right? So if you're a man and you decide, you know what, financial independence is not something that I'm just not going to have a career. That's not something that I actually value or care about. Be prepared for the judgment, right? And I'm not saying that that's a good, I'm not it's an unfortunate thing, but just be prepared for it. But also be very careful, because I don't think the perception that we get judged tends to also be magnified in our mind. So for example, like if I meet 10 people and one of them judges me, my brain isn't actually going to calculate that only 10% of people judge me. There's actually a really, really important cognitive bias that we're biased towards the negative. So if you get judged by a single person, and that happens 2 or 3 times out of a group of, let's say, 10 people, 10 people, 10 people, your mind will start to think everyone is judging me this way, which just isn't factually true, but that's just the nature of the mind. So be a little bit careful about that. So at the end of the day, I think that healthy masculinity, or masculinity in general, as we're sort of seeing, is undergoing a crisis of sorts. We're sort of going through a period of what I would call rediscovery. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. So what we're sort of noticing is that there are traditional masculine characteristics, which as society evolves, as technology evolves, some of those characteristics are no longer sort of necessary for men. So there's been a diffusion of responsibility. There's been a growth of independence of both genders. And as a result, what it means to be a man is changing. What makes this really, really tough, though, is that I think that society, in terms of the judgment that men face, is lagging behind. And this doesn't, once again, we are not necessarily saying that there aren't judgments that are lagging behind for women as well. I hope I can make one statement without it being comparative to someone else. But I think we're sort of seeing actually like evidence that even though men are, the genders are getting closer and closer and closer together in terms of like what they're capable of and what kind of work and things like that they do, we're sort of seeing evidence of some kind of judgment that kind of lags behind. And then what happens is men will tend to compensate for that, right? So as the world judges me for not being manly enough in one direction, what I have to do is make up for that by a hypertrophy, which means growth, of another dimension of masculinity. And it's that hypertrophy of that other dimension of masculinity, which I think can really lead into what we call toxic masculinity, which is kind of like an exaggeration of particular masculine traits. And at the end of the day, though, I think the way to avoid that is to sort of take a step back, really think about, okay, what do I expect? What does society expect from me? What do I expect from myself? And to really lean into being ultimately independent and responsible, not to a fault, right? So you don't need to be completely independent. I think that's the example of hypertrophy of independence. Like you should be relatively independent. But all human beings are going to require the support of other human beings. And at the end of the day, if you kind of notice, oh, those aren't masculine characteristics, I completely agree. Because I think ultimately a healthy gender identity has a lot more to with being healthy than it does with like the particular gender identity. So that's my take on masculinity. Let's see if people have questions. What do y'all think? Yeah, so Lobster Lord is saying women play a big role in this as well. A good number still value those classic male attributes, which is totally fine, right? So that's my point, is that anytime I hear this discussion, there's an assumption that the opposite gender is responsible for the judgment. Whereas in my experience, like everyone's responsible for the judgment, right? Men will judge men for not being able to have a job. Men will judge men for not being in shape. Men will judge men for having small penises, right? Like even like a couple years ago, I made jokes about micropenis and I realized like that was wrong. So apologize for it. But like men are just as judgmental towards men and women are just as judgmental towards women. So I think that like, this is where people fall into trouble is as men start to feel resentful, what we tend to do is blame the opposite gender. Whereas like, I'm not saying that the opposite gender is not to some degree at fault, but it's not like we're not at fault either. Right? I think judgment is the problem. I'm curious if this hypercompensation is also hiring only women in STEM careers. So I think when it comes to the intersection of profession and gender, that's a whole different can of worms. So this is the other thing that I think we've got to be really careful about when we discuss gender issues, is it's really easy to lean into, let's say, good anthropological science, make statements that are like well supported. And then the moment we open up professions, there's actually a whole other body of research. So one of the things that really frustrates me about gender dynamics is that people assume that like data from one column applies to something else. Whereas if you really look at it scientifically, piles of research from anthropology, even evolutionary biology, and like statistics on careers and things like that are like, there's a bunch of different data that you have to consider. The other thing to remember in general, so we learned this in science. So for a long time, there was a nature-nurture debate, right? A particular behavior happens. Is it nature or is it nurture? And it turns out that the answer for most things scientifically is this word called multifactorial. Multifactorial means it's not just one thing. It's a contribution of different variables. And in fact, the more variables you include, the closer you get to the real formula. This concept is completely lost in gender discussions, right? Everyone's so focused on discrimination against men or women. No one's really paying attention to each other. And there's a lot more at play than discrimination. The reason that there are more men in STEM careers versus women in STEM careers has something to do with discrimination, but it also has to do with a lot of other things. And so if y'all want to talk about profession, like the intersection of gender and profession, fascinating subject, but there's a lot more nuance than most people discuss. Because what happens in those kinds of situations is people tend to have particular experiences which are emotionally charged. And once that emotion takes over, they don't look at things objectively. Right? And I'm not saying that men or women are more guilty of this. I've seen this both ways. I've seen men who are in STEM careers that get passed over by a woman. And they're like, oh, this is like, you know, since there's so few women in STEM careers, they're getting treated advantageously. This hurts me. Therefore, I'm going to blame them. Whereas like, it's possible that there was discrimination. That's absolutely possible. But it's also possible that the reason that your colleague was promoted is because they're better at their job than you are. And the flip is also true, where, you know, women will sort of like also be concerned about discrimination, whereas like there could be discrimination. Chances are there was one instance of discrimination that really, really hurt. And then we start to see discrimination everywhere, which it could be everywhere. But oftentimes in my experience working with women in professional settings, the ones that are the most successful are the ones that accept some amount of individual responsibility, assign discrimination its appropriate weight. But it's not like discrimination is responsible for everything in the workplace. The truth is that most issues are multifactorial. And maybe that's like an offensive statement, but that's been my experience. Like if you look at, you know, what does it take to grow up with a personality disorder? It takes a lot of different things. Socioeconomic status matters, attachment style matters, parents matter, parents' personality structures matter. The truth is that most of science, especially when it comes to humanity, is like complex. It's not explainable by one variable. And I think that oversimplification is causing lots of problems. Because then what happens is when we oversimplify and we assume everything is discrimination, and then we focus on that one thing, we're not actually addressing all the other issues at play. So maybe I've succeeded at offending everyone, hopefully not. But so Greedo 8 is saying, I wonder how you would apply this topic to those who are non-binary. Are they just exempt from the societal expectations? No. So when it comes to being non-binary, I think this makes things even more challenging in some ways, because you're not necessarily exempt from societal expectations. When you're non-binary, sometimes you get judged from both sides of the coin. So sometimes you actually have twice the judgment. And the challenge is that if you're non-binary, it's a little bit unclear what is an ideal that you should be shooting for, right? So like, even if you say that there are attitudes of masculinity and femininity that are harmful, which I completely agree with, it's easy from a sense of a compass. Like we've got a direction to point towards, whether that direction is good or bad. The challenge with being non-binary is that you don't even have a compass. Right? So what is the ideal non-binary person? I think that's harder to understand. It's harder to come up with a answer. We're not saying it's the right one. It's easy to envision what the ideal masculine of a man is. It's easy to envision what the ideal, woman is. It's hard to envision what an ideal non-binary person is, which is precisely why I like the yogic perspective, because yogic perspective is about being a good human. So like to be independent and responsible. I think those are fantastic ideals for someone who's non-binary. It's a great question. What's with Dr. K apologizing for every statement? It's because every time we've tried to talk about gender dynamics, someone gets offended. And I'm trying not to offend people. So it requires a lot of apologies. And for people who are saying, oh, stop apologizing. So this is what's important to understand about making apologies when it comes to gender dynamics. So if we don't make apologies, who is going to listen to what we have to say? The people that agree with us, right? They will listen. But who needs to listen to what we have to say? Not just the people that agree with us. We need the other side to listen as well. And so in order to engage them in conversation, we have to offer disclaimers. And that's okay. Does that make sense? Part of the problem with the internet is that you have people who are like doubling down and not offering disclaimers, not offering a different perspective. And so what they end up doing is alienating the people that disagree with them. And so then I've got my camp and I ain't gonna apologize for shit. It's your fault. And then the other side is like, I ain't gonna apologize for shit. It's your fault. And there's so much antagonism. And that's where like, I'm gonna speak my truth. And all the rabble-rousers behind me with their pitchforks are like, yeah, let's go. And on the flip side, you've got the rabble-rousers who believe the exact opposite. They've got their pitchforks and they're let's go. So the issue is that if you are on one side of the camp, you shouldn't be speaking to your side. You should be speaking to the opposite side. You should engage them in dialogue. Try to understand, why do you believe the things? Like, how can you believe what you believe? Right? We don't ever stop to ask ourselves, how did this person get to this conclusion? We just say this conclusion is wrong. And then everyone selectively cites sources. But what about this? But what about this? But what about this? And then like you miss the original point, right? It's like if a patient comes into my office with testicular cancer and someone jumps in and says, but breast cancer is more common. It's like, yeah, sure, breast cancer is more common, but like this person has testicular cancer and they need help today. So there's no reason to correlate or discuss breast cancer and testicular cancer together. But this is what's happening in gender dynamic discussions. Someone is trying to share something about my experience of being a man or a woman. And the first thing that happens, but what about this other experience? It's like, that's not the experience we're talking about. Right? And then what happens is when I try to share my experience, let's say as a man, and someone else says, but what about this with women? Men are greater. So let's say like I make a statement like, you know, the number of men who get helped after being sexually assaulted is very, very low. And then someone counters with, but men are more often perpetrators of sexual assault than women. And so then what happens is like, let's forget for a moment about what statement is true or not. Both of those statements are probably true. But then what happens is, how do I feel when someone says that? Like, I don't feel heard. And then if I don't feel heard and someone else says that, right, they're like, oh, but like men are more commonly sexual assault perpetrators. That could be like a really important point. But if I don't feel heard, I'm not going to listen to that. And then what ends up happening is like, once I try to share something that I struggle with and someone shoots me down, then I sure as hell am not going to be like listening to them. And then the moment that they say something, the resentment in my heart comes up and I'm going to counter whatever they say. But what about this? But what about this? And now what's happened is both people are struggling and no one is like paying attention. And for what it's worth, I think the gender discussions in our community are getting way healthier. I don't know if y'all have noticed this, but like, honestly, this is the only place on the internet that I consistently see people who have different experiences of gender that will like regularly support each other. Only place. And I'm not saying that to, it's like literally like you can go, because what we have on the internet is we have safe spaces for a particular group, right? And it's like, we've got echo chambers. We have nowhere where the echo chambers collide. And what happened actually with us, I don't know if y'all paid attention, echo chambers collided. And then some people got really upset and left. The people who stuck around, though, like, now we actually have dialogue. I never realized that, you know, so a man sort of talks about being alone, and then someone else is like, I'm an attractive woman and I feel alone all the time. And everyone was like, what? That's possible? And someone else recently, I saw a great post about, you know, I'm a lesbian woman and I feel alone. And it's like, wow, it seems like maybe what we struggle with as human beings may have a gender component, but it turns out that, like, most human beings can share a lot of experiences. It turns out that suffering is not uniquely male or uniquely female. Shocking. I know it's wild. It's wild. Yeah, so Uberwolf23 is saying, I'm non-binary, but accept people who don't understand or agree. I get ostracized by both sides. People just can't wrap their head around it. I'm with you. Right? It's like, they're trying to bucket you. And the thing is, you don't fall into either bucket. So even if you check some of the boxes, everyone hyper-focuses on the boxes you don't check. Which is true of both masculinity and femininity as well. Like, just think about it. Even if I'm a man, and I have a nice bushy beard, and I know how to chop firewood and I know how to grill, people will be focused on, oh, like, I don't have a job because I'm out in the wilderness all day, right? And if you're a woman, it's like you can have a fantastic career, but then people will keep asking you, like, why don't you have kids? Right? And if you decide to have kids, people will like some of those, like, you know, career women will, like, look at you with pity in their eyes and they'll be like, I can't believe you gave it up for this. Like, the judgment, there's no end to the judgment. So that's like, when it comes to being, like, a good human being in gender dynamics, like, you can't stop other people from judging. The only thing that you can really do is stop judging yourself. And by that, I mean, don't judge yourself, but also don't judge other people, right? Like, the judgment stops here. Like, you can't control the rest of it. So New Century Trader is saying it's just biology and evolutionary impulses. So I think that's a great starting point, but I think something has changed, which is that the way that we exchange information and experiences, and especially technology, is hijacking biological and evolutionary impulses. That's what we're seeing. So we've evolved to be a particular way, but the problem is that our brain has not evolved for social media. And the reason that social media is both so successful and so damaging is because it, like, hyperactivates some parts of our brain, which doesn't necessarily mean that when I say social media is so damaging, I'm not saying that social media is all bad, right? So it can be used for a lot of good. It's just like, it's like human beings have discovered fire. And it's like, wow, this is really great. But it's like, it can burn you, it can burn down our house, and it can be used to eliminate bacteria and parasites from our food. It's like, wow, this is a very powerful tool. And this is something that I really believe. I think in 40, 50 years, we're going to look back at technology usage and realize that, much like cocaine and nicotine and some of these other substances that were really harmful, there was just, like, widespread unregulated use. And over time, people are going to get wise to how damaging social technology can be. Yeah, so people are saying Twitter in a nutshell. So, like, that's the other issue with gender dynamics discussions, is that Twitter is such a useful platform because it's so easy to do it for 5 minutes, but Twitter literally does not allow you to have a nuanced response. Right? So what you see on the platform is the more extreme the views, the more likely they are to spread. Because the more extreme they are, the more emotionally engaging they are. The more emotionally engaging they are, the more people react to them. The more people are engaged, Twitter's like, great. People are engaged on our platform instead of any of our competitors. And as more people are engaged, we get more revenue. So everyone is fighting for your engagement. And they'll do whatever they need to get it. So, you know, I saw an interesting post, like what needs to happen in politics. And I think this is true. What I'm about to say, I think is like how can we fix politics in the world or in this country, whatever. I think what we need to start doing is having conversations where instead of trying to like win, we try to understand. What I see in political discourse is like everyone's trying to win. Haha, you are an idiot because of this. I'm better. I'm wiser. I'm smarter. You're such an idiot. You're such an idiot. And even if you win, I don't think that it actually like fixes anything. I mean, maybe obviously it fixes some things because if you get elected, then you're in power and you can influence policy. But then what happens is like the opposition party like throws up as many roadblocks as they can, right? Whereas like I think what's really crazy is we talk about political parties as how they're separate. Like liberals believe this and conservatives believe this. And these are the issues that we fight on. These are the issues that we get elected on. These are the issues that we legislate on. Whereas if you really look at it, all of us agree on this crap. And like this is actually what we should be working on. But no one talks about this because we're also focused on these two things. And this is, I think that's completely true of gender dynamics as well. Anyway, I opened a can of worms with politics. I'm just saying, like, this is what's happening in discussion. There's like polarization happening on the internet. We see it in politics. We see it in gender dynamics. We also see it in things like which MOBA do you play, right? Are you like Xbox or PlayStation? There's just like Apple versus Android. Yeah, LeBron's Turtle is saying it's so black and white, which is what the mind gravitates towards. But the reality is that the world is not black or white. We just like don't even think about that though when we engage with other people. People are saying Dota versus LOL. I don't think so, Flux Wildly. Han versus Heroes of the Storm. All right. So Wolver Gotkex is asking Dr. K versus Andrew Tate. So I'm still not entirely sure who this person is. But I think this is a key point, right? So there's this idea of versus, where it's like, I don't think it needs to be antagonistic. We set everything up. Everyone's like talking about debates. Whereas like, imagine what the world would be like where if people had differing views, instead of having a debate where the goal is for one person to come out on top, the goal was to try to like increase understanding of both perspectives. Does that make sense? I'm not saying there isn't value to debate. What I'm saying is that most issues of disagreement, the default is debate. And there's a winner and there's a loser. That's the problem, is that you can't make a winner without a loser. Right, so we see this. Like, this is where, like, someone mentioned Andrew Huberman. So I think good examples of this, you know, I know people like Joe Rogan and stuff get flack, but I think, like, Andrew Huberman, Joe Rogan, some of these, like, I love this podcast format because it's, like, talking to people about stuff. It's not about winning or losing. It's about understanding. I think those are fantastic. I don't even understand some of this. Right? So, like, I think it's like having, I love this phrase that Install Gen 2 is saying, yes, those are good faith conversations. I think that's what's missing, is good faith conversations. Everyone's debating. No one's having a good faith conversation. Love the way that you described it. So someone's saying something created Andrew Tate's views, and fighting or denying everything they have to say further ostracizes people that may relate to them, making the problem worse. Vulcan 977. I agree. Right? I think that this is where, like, if you disagree with someone, I mean, should you hold people accountable for their actions? Yes. And at the same time, like, there's not enough discussion. Why don't people have good faith conversations? 19 Roy 50 asks. For two reasons. People don't have good conversations for two reasons. Number one is we aren't taught how. Number two is it's easy not to. It's harder to have a good faith conversation than it is to reflexively react to things. And no one teaches us. And like, what are our role models? Debates. Right? I remember watching Jon Stewart on Crossfire like back in 2011 or something. And he was like, we need to stop doing political theater and actually like start having conversations. And I completely agree with him. I don't know if that qualifies as a political view. I'm not trying to say that conservative or liberal is better, but doesn't that just mean skill issue, Dr. K? I think so, right? So I think there's a lack of skills. Like, we don't know how to listen. We're a society that is not being heard. And so our antidote to not being heard is yelling louder and louder and louder and louder and louder instead of listening. And so as a result of everyone yelling louder to be heard, because no one knows how to listen, you get the cacophony that you get today. Have y'all been on the internet? It's a fucking mess. It's just people yelling at each other and no one listening. You even see it, like I browse some forums where people will discuss games. And someone will be like, hey, how do I deal with this thing in a game? And people will give them answers. And what does the person do? They don't even listen. They start arguing. They're like, no, that doesn't, you're wrong. It's like, what the hell? You were the one who asked. Here's my answer. And then it degenerates into some kind of fight where it's like the person asked the question is not even willing to listen. Right? And this is where, like, yeah, because they prey on bad faith arguments, Fango Lives is saying. So this is what happens. Like, when someone says something and we find a logical weakness in the argument, we attack and we dismantle them. Ha ha, I have won. You walk out of that conversation feeling like you're all the hot shit. They feel stupid. Has anyone understood anything? Have you convinced them by dismantling their argument? Of course not. Have you understood them by dismantling their argument? Of course not. But you are the winner and they are the loser. Doesn't actually make the world a better place. Don't gift me. Get wrecked, random person. All right. Yeah, so your boy Ionize is saying debates don't have the purpose of convincing the person you talk to, but the audience, though. I agree that it's a bad tool to learn how to talk to someone. Great point, right? So generally speaking, an excellent nuance about debates is that it's really directed towards the audience. But that, too, is like convincing the audience. So here's what I would bounce back with. I'm not disagreeing with, I think debate has a purpose. But imagine what would happen in the audience if the goal of the debate was for both people participating to understand each other's worldview. I think that would actually be the biggest win for the audience, because then you see the value and lack of value on both sides. It's not about proving your value. It's about demonstrating what the value is and acknowledging that the other person believes it for a reason, right? Not all human beings are idiots. It's not like I'm the only smart human being and I've figured out the right thing and everyone else believes what they believe because they're idiots. That's the whole problem, is that like human beings, and this is what you learn as a psychiatrist, is that people will do really stupid things. But this is going to be a strong statement. I don't think I've ever met someone who did a really stupid thing without a really good reason. Anytime I work with patients who make terrible decisions, what you have to understand is they've got a really good reason to do it. And it's in the lack of appreciation for that good reason that people get stuck. Right? Because then it's just you're an idiot. The solution is stop being an idiot. That doesn't work. Right? If that worked, the world would be a very different place. Is there a strategy for what to do if you find yourself talking to someone who wants to debate you when you want to have an understanding boosting conversation? Absolutely. Just ask them, what are you trying to accomplish in this conversation? And they're like, oh, I just want to talk. So are you trying to teach me something? Are you trying to convince me of something? Are you trying to explain to me how my viewpoint is wrong? And they'll say, no, I'm not doing any of those things. So then help me understand. So I'll make a statement. And what I've noticed is that every time I make a statement, you'll point out to me in some way why the statement is wrong. So for example, I said this, you responded with this. I said this, you responded with this. I'm just trying to understand, what are you trying to accomplish in the conversation? So then, like, if they say like, oh, I'm just trying to understand your perspective. So you could say, okay, that's not what I'm experiencing. So in my experience, when people want to understand something that I have to say, they tend to ask questions. You don't seem to be doing that. Or if you're asking questions, they tend to be questions that are designed to trap. I feel like each question you're asking is like a trap. I would start there. See what they say, right? Because they fall into it without even realizing it. Fairly Honest is saying, do you think there needs to be better education on logical fallacies, statistics, how data can be manipulated to safeguard people against common misleading debate tactics? Absolutely. I think everyone should be familiar with this stuff. So here's what one of my favorite professors taught me about statistics. Statistics are like a swimsuit. What they reveal is enticing, but what they conceal is vital. So you can cite statistics, and then you can interpret them a particular way. That's why we try to even be nuanced in the statistics that we cite, right? So we'll even go into detail, like sort of saying that, you know, people's attitudes towards men being good financial earners, what a lot of people, so like people who are dating, if you take the pool of people who are dating and you ask them, how important is it for a man to be financially independent and be able to provide for his family? Like 80% of people in that pool will say it's very important. Now, what a lot of people will do is interpret this as, oh, women are unfairly judging men. Hold on a second. Men hold that view too, right? And ask yourself, if you're a man listening to this, like, how would I feel if I had a family and I wasn't financially providing for them? So I think it's really important to understand this stuff. Y'all heard the stomach going burr? Ain't got no time to eat, chat. I don't know if that means that I'm very hungry or my mic is very good. Statistically speaking, Dr. K won't read this message. You are correct. Psycher 24. Evi 2 is, what if the other person is wrong, like a no-vax, and I just want him to realize the truth? Should I just be curious? Question number 1. What makes you know the truth? right? Because the whole point of the anti-vax person is they're going to say, you don't know the truth. I know the truth. You have fallen into the media indoctrination and thus have become separated from the truth. That's the challenge. Right? So this conversation starts off on the wrong foot when you know the truth and they are deluded. And you learn this. So like just to share some clinical experience. So like sometimes in psychiatry, we deal with people who are experiencing psychosis. Psychosis is, like, generally speaking, experiencing either delusions or hallucinations, having sensory stimuli. Sometimes there are delusional beliefs. Pretty sure this person is psychotic. Person comes into the emergency room, says, I'm the son of God. So honestly, what I learned after years of training is the first step is understand this person may actually be divine. Could be, right? How do I know they're not divine? Let's just meet them where they're at. Okay, you're divine. How does that work? What do you feel? Like, how did you become divine? Like, that sounds sweet. Tell me about it. Right? Like, who knows? Like, people have said, like, you know, this idea of divinity is well conserved within human history. The Christians believe that Jesus will come again at some point. Like, maybe this is him, right? It's been prophesized. Like, who am I to say that it isn't? I'm not even Christian. How am I going to be able to judge who is the Son of God in the second coming? Like, I don't know anything about that. So let's talk about it. So then we get to one of my favorite conversations, which I had on the inpatient unit as an intern. Was that when I was at MGH? So we're going to modify a couple things, make them chimerical. Sometimes people come in, believe that they are divine. Sometimes they'll come in and believe things like, I'm Jesus Christ. I'm the second incarnation. And then we have to have a very difficult conversation. So I get into a room with 3 patients. We all sit down together. And I tell them, so as I understand it, each of you is the second incarnation of Jesus Christ. What are we going to do about this? Which one of you is it? Right? And then we end up having a conversation about, like, I don't know. Each of y'all insists it's you. Y'all don't believe everyone else. But here's what we've got to figure out. We're here to try to get better, right? We're here to try to, like, there are people here who are struggling with anxiety and people here who are struggling with depression. What I need y'all to do is stop fighting in the cafeteria. We have a conversation about it. It's not my place to say which one of you. I don't know. Y'all all disagree. Can we agree to disagree? Great. So can we stop throwing food at each other? Thank you very much. Right? So, like, I don't know. Maybe one of them was the second incarnation of Christ. Who knows? It's not for me to judge. Okay, so this is a great question. So Drop a Sub for the Boys is asking, how do you present yourself as up for a discussion, conversation, and not just a heated debate? Sometimes I think people find calmness in an argument infuriating, and then that anger dynamic remains. Excellent question. So we're going to actually move on to our next topic. So what we're going to do, because I think this will get to this. So a lot of people are asking questions about, like, how to have discussions. So now what I want to talk to you all about is an unfortunately common situation where you are someone who's trying to put your life together, but you live with people who are making it hard. And the challenge with this is that what the internet will tell you to do is just leave them behind, right? Like, anytime someone is making your life hard and they're not respecting you or valuing you or carrying their own share of responsibility, the advice is just peace out. Because it's easy for someone on the internet for them to tell you to abandon your family because they're not doing the abandoning. It's not their family, right? I can tell other people to abandon their family all the time. Easy. Abandoning my own family, now that's different. So what we're going to do is explore a little bit about what it's like, first of all, if you live in a situation where your family is like really not helping you, if you feel guilty and trapped by them, how to engage with them, and then explore a little bit about what to do in this situation. Because I think this is a situation that we don't talk about enough. Okay, so let's take a look. So this is going to be kind of long, but we got to get through it all. How can I self-improve while living in an environment very unconducive to it? My environment, I-26M, live with my parents. I'm not broke. They are. They need my help. So from the beginning, we have responsibility. Trapped. My dad is in his early 60s and basically retired. He has no retirement fund and lives off of Social Security checks and food stamps. He's kind and supportive to me, but beyond that, he's a very annoying person to deal with his whole personality is watching conspiracy theory videos, and he lets that affect his real life decision making. Not getting the vaccine, even though mom is immunocompromised, not saving money because he thinks banks are going under, and wasting $1,000+ a year on a garden because he thinks the food supply chain will be destroyed. Wow. My mom is late 50s and dying. She has multiple medical conditions, some out of her control, some stemming from being a chronic smoker. Her father died when I was in high school, and ever since, she fell into a deep depression, stopped working, and gave up. We've tried to get her some form of income in the form of disability income, but she's extremely uncooperative with doing the paperwork. And we also believe the window for getting that has passed. I don't know how terminal her conditions are, though I did Google one of them, and it says she'll be lucky to make it 5 years. My brother, 21, also lives with us, but the pandemic disrupted his plans to start college. He's fallen deeper and deeper into his video game addiction. He eats extremely unhealthy because of my parents' laissez-faire style of parenting, let him do whatever he wants to without discipline or direction. His diet is literally peanuts, pretzels, Cheez-Its, goldfish, and chips. I've offered him $100 plus to try new foods, and he refuses. This means that a nearly unlimited supply of those junk food are in the house at all times. I've begged my dad to give him some tough love, threatened to take away his video games if he doesn't start doing stuff like getting a driver's license and applying to college, but he won't. My brother is well over 300 pounds and on the path to die at 35. He literally has a free ride to college waiting for him through FAFSA, but refuses to go. The moment my parents die, the free ride goes away, and he's either going to have to drown in debt or go get a shit job that doesn't live up to his potential. For some reason, he doesn't see this massive risk to him, though, because he's never been given any consequences his entire life. So essentially, my environment is crap, and there's nothing I can do about it. Don't tell me to move out. They can't afford the mortgage without me, and I'm not going to let my mom go homeless her last few years of life. I'm not going to let my brother go without having one person in the house who cares about trying to motivate him to fulfill his potential. My dad, honestly, I wouldn't feel bad about forcing to handle the consequence of his own decisions, but I won't turn my back on my brother and mom. However, this comes with sacrifices that make it incredibly difficult to fulfill my own potential. There's junk food and unhealthy meals around me 24/7. If I want to not binge eat, it takes pure willpower. There's no just bringing in bad food to the house. I have massive anxiety about catching and bringing home the virus because my mom and dad are unvaxxed. This stresses me and leads me to do things that I not want to do. Not doing things that I want to. I dodge the whole environment issue by constantly not being at home, work in the office, study at a coffee shop, etc., but that exposes them to more risk. I live 40 minutes from my work and friends. It's very hard to date. As kind-hearted as helping my parents out is, me not having a place to go hook up is an attraction killer. Like it or not, being a 26-year-old man who lives at home with his parents in America, no matter how valid the reason, is a deal breaker for a lot of quality, independent women. I pay $200 a month more in rent to my parents than I did at my last place. Additionally, there are gas costs. Anytime there's a major... my mom knows how to guilt me into buying her every last comfort item she wants. Basically, anytime I go out to eat fast food, I'm buying for two and she's guilting me about it. Anytime there's a major expense for them, it's me. The electric bill goes too high, I'm paying it. My parents' dogs need inoculations, I'm paying. Dogs can get vaccinations, by the way. Our internet modem gets struck by lightning, I'm buying the replacement. It's financially draining to me. I don't like the city I live in. It doesn't have access to the types of concerts, sporting events, or even young, ambitious, diverse people I want to be friends with. My city also has very limited job prospects for my field of study. I could easily go to a bigger city where I find a job where I earn 2x my income, but instead I'm stuck in a crappy entry-level job trying to do everything I can to angle my way up the ladder without blowing a chance at one of the few companies in my area who offers the jobs that I want. The house is very dirty, and while I've put substantial work into making my room a clean space, being one person trying to clean up the mess made over years by 4 people is extremely difficult. This also means I have to work from home in my room, which is difficult space to be productive in. They've refused to give me an office despite me asking at least once a month. You're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with, and 3 of these 5 people are issues that I described, or people with issues I described. I'm not trying to blame my current state, 5'8", 260 pounds, struggling in career, depressed, on my family. I want to do whatever I can to help myself and them at the same time. But living in this environment isn't helping whatsoever. What can I do to find a way to work on improving myself while also living in an environment where almost every obstacle imaginable is put up on a daily basis, and the people I live with couldn't care less about self-improvement? So this is tough, okay? Way too common. We don't talk about this situation enough. I'm a good person. I'm trying to put my life together. I have a job. I'm going to do what a good son does. I'm going to help out my family, right? I can't abandon my mom. Like, she's ill, potentially terminally ill. If I don't pay them rent, they can't afford the mortgage. I'm not willing to let my mom become homeless. My brother is moving in the wrong direction, and someone's got to try to help him. And it ain't going to be dad, because dad spends his whole time, like watching conspiracy theory videos. Mom won't do the paperwork to get additional income. Won't do the paperwork to file for disability. Brother refuses to go to college, plays video games all day, eats like crap, and parents enable his bad behavior. And he doesn't even try to help them, right? So he enables their bad behavior, they enable his bad behavior, and you've got one person in the household who's trying to keep it together, and they're drowning. So what a lot of people will do in this situation is say, there's no way you can help people who don't want to help themselves. Leave. Get out while you can. They'll even do things like, we'll say things like, oh, if you can earn twice as much in a separate city, move out of the house, earn twice as much, and send money back to try to support your parents. Right? There are all kinds of solutions that people will offer. Just stop doing X, Y, Z. Abandon your family. But this person is very clear, I'm not willing to abandon them. Right? Is this guilt? Are they victims of guilt? Because we do know that this person gets emotionally manipulated. The guilt gets the better of them. But how do you draw the line between doing your duty as a family member and not abandoning your family versus avoiding guilt and being manipulated by guilt, right? Because that's like, it's subtle, it's important. So what we're going to do today is talk about how to approach this situation. There's going to be a lot of details. There's going to be a lot of like nuts and bolts of conversations. It's going to be hard to follow. It's also most likely not going to work out the way I'm going to explain it. Right? So expect a lot of difficulties. But the truth of the matter is that there is a way to have a conversation, to work with your family, to get on the same page. I've seen it happen. It's a hard tightrope to walk, but there is a tightrope. And because it's so hard to walk, no one tries to walk it. Everyone says, don't even bother, just live for yourself. Okay? So let's dive in. The first thing that you have to do is have conversations, okay? You have to have a space and a time and a regularity of conversations. This is the first goal. Because you can't, what a lot of people will also suggest is that you use your financial power in a relationship to enforce compliance, right? So this person is even saying, Dad, use tough love on your son. Like people can say like, stop paying for stuff unless they start doing things. And we'll get to boundary setting and like reinforcement and stuff like that. But there's sort of this idea that like, if you're the breadwinner in the household, you can use your power to enforce behavior for other people. That's going to be really hard. Not saying that it isn't worth doing, but first of all, this person gets emotionally guilted. It seems like they don't really have a good role model for how to do that. So let's assume for a moment that we want to use power as a last resort. Let's assume for a moment that we're going to try to make it work in this household. So how do you do that? The first thing is you have to have regular conversations. And what I would do is these conversations need to be kind of meta level, and they need to be avoiding judgment. So what I would do is I would ask everyone in your household, hey, I think we should start sitting down and talking a little bit about the direction that this family is going in, and like whether, if we're happy with things, great, let's continue doing them. If we're unhappy with things, we should at least sit down and kind of talk about it. Now, already your family will be on the defensive because they'll think that this conversation is about them. You got to ask them, hey, are we willing to, like, can we all just get together and talk for 1 hour a week for the next 4 weeks, just about how things are going? So you have to demonstrate some amount of leadership in this situation. You have to frame a conversation. Now, getting them to come is a real problem, because if they choose not to come, what is the stick that you're going to use if a carrot doesn't work? And I wouldn't start bribing them with money and say, hey, I'll give you money if you come. I would just say, hey, this family is important to me. Like, there's some stuff that I'm concerned about. I think we should start talking about it and working on it together as a family. You got to get everyone in the room. Once you do that, you have to be kind of careful, because remember, everyone's going to be defensive, right? They're like thinking, I'm going to talk about, he's going to blame me because I'm not doing something right. Because your whole family knows that they're not doing things right. Everyone knows. So then what you've got to do is you've got to ask them questions, open-ended questions, non-judgmental questions. Hey, I'd love to hear from everyone what they like about how we do things at home. So mom, can you tell me a little bit about what you like? Dad, can you tell me a little bit about what you like? Brother, do you tell me a little bit about what you like? Next thing you're going to do is you're going to ask a question. Okay, does anyone think that I could be doing things differently? Or are there things that I do or say that you think make it hard to live here that bother you? So you're going to start by opening actually up to your own faults, right? We need to disarm the defensiveness from your family. So you can say, okay, what can I do better? Now, you can't start by asking your mom, hey, what can mom do better? We need to get to that conversation. But you have to start by sort of pointing out to yourself, okay, what are your flaws? Okay, so mom thinks I could be doing this better. Mom thinks I could be doing this better. And then you're going to model something else. Once they say stuff, you're going to add stuff to the list. You're going to say, in addition to that, mom, I notice that sometimes I'm not quite as generous when I eat out with fast food. So one thing that I'm going to work on is not making you feel like you have to beg me if I'm going to get food, because I don't like the way that, that creates emotions between us. So I'm going to work on that. You're going to model for them that people can point out things about you that are not perfect, and that you can accept their feedback and you can try to work on them. Because I don't see this in the family. I don't see a structure of, if there's a problem, let's be intentional about diagnosing it and fixing it. Everyone just kind of lets things go. So once you have that conversation, and this could be over the course of 2 weeks, so we've already met twice, okay? Week number 3, you need to start talking to people about what they're unhappy with the house. We're not even gonna get to specific people. How do y'all feel about the kitchen? Do y'all like living in this kitchen? What about the living room? What about this room? Then what you've got to ask your family is, what do we want to do about this stuff? Right? We can all agree that the kitchen is a mess. What do y'all think we should do about this? And this is really important. When you live in a family and you know everything wrong that people are doing, brother's playing video games all the time, dad is watching conspiracy theory videos, mom is not taking care of her health and continues to smoke, and y'all are having financial problems and your mom is a chronic smoker, those things could be related. Can y'all even afford cigarettes? You see all the problems in your family. But if you go in there and you start charging about, hey, you're doing this wrong, you're doing this wrong, you're doing this wrong, you're doing this wrong, no one's going to listen. Right? And then you get fed up with frustration and you post about it on the internet and you're like, I've tried to help them. And everyone's like, you've done your best. Let them go. Go be independent. You've tried everything you've tried. So this is really important. If you are trying to get your family involved in changing the household, you have to give them some latitude in what the solutions are. You can't tell them, hey, this is the standard to which the kitchen is going to clean. I need all y'all to listen. If you want to exert financial power, you can do that. But the whole point is that I don't think that's going to work very well. So you've got to ask them, okay, what do y'all think we should do about the kitchen? And you want to get everyone's input. Because if they suggest something, then like they're more likely to listen, right? Obviously. So then you listen, you write these things down. Okay, dad thinks we should do this. Maybe we should all like eat together and clean together for 5 minutes. Brother thinks that we should do this. So as you get these different kinds of solutions, you put them down on a piece of paper, and then you ask people, okay, like who is willing to take responsibility for this? Ask the question to your family, whose job is it to keep this place clean? And then people will basically like point to anyone but themselves, right? They'll say like, oh, it's the woman's job. And then mom will say, but I'm ill, I can't do it. And then your brother's like, well, I can't do it for this reason. And so then you're going to just point that out to people and say like, okay, what are we going to do about this as a family? Because no one wants to accept responsibility for this. I work, I have to drive 40 minutes. Mom is sick. Dad doesn't know how to do it. Brother doesn't get around to it. And so what are we going to do about this? So this is really important, but you sort of need to be the leader here, but you can't tell people what to do. The way that you're going to be the leader is by framing the conversation, and you're going to let them come up with the answers, because now you know like what amount of fuel your family is going to give you. And if people say like, okay, like we're going to do this, this, and this, and you've got to be super careful here because people will make big, big promises. So then you need to have another conversation, maybe week 4 now. So people have said they're going to do particular things. What happens when someone doesn't do what they say they're going to do? And this is where all kinds of things could happen. People could get defensive. They're like, well, you don't do what you say you're going to do. And you're like, yeah, I completely understand that. I'm not saying I'm better than anyone else here. What I'm saying is, as a family, what is our system of accountability? Right? Like, what do we do for people? Like, if someone says they're going to do something and they don't do it, like, what happens? And then people are going to kind of shrug. And you're going to say, okay, so like, I think I'm seeing a problem is that this, as a family, we don't really hold each other accountable really at all. And so people get to do what they want to, which is exactly why the kitchen is a mess. Because no one's accountable. What do y'all think about that? Is that fair? I'm not blaming any one of you because we all do it, right? We all participate in it. We're all like guilty in this together. The question is, do we as a family want to change? And if so, what are we willing to do? And what kind of consequences are we willing to impose? There's also like other like really basic stuff that you're going to have to talk about with your family, like finances. So this is where we're going to get everyone together and we're going to say, okay, so like, I'd like to talk about finances. I'd like to understand what we as a family are going to do. Like, let's try to figure this out. Like, who's open to trying to figure it out? I'm not blaming anyone. I'm just trying to figure out what's the money we have coming in, what's the money we have going out. So this is where, especially if you grow up in a household with financially irresponsible parents, you as a kid, this is completely foreign to you. Some kids take this for granted because like their parents automatically taught them how to do it. They were given allowances. They were given certain amounts of money. They were taught financial responsibility from a young age. But if your parents don't know how to be financially responsible, you certainly don't know how to be financially responsible. So you've got to figure it out and then you've got to teach them. So I would start with something as simple as a budget. Every month, what is all the money that we have coming in to this household? What is all the money that we have going out? How much do we spend on food? How much do we spend on mortgage? How much do we spend on electricity? How much do we spend on cigarettes? And then what you're going to do is you're going to point out, okay, what is everyone's responsibility here? So I'm bringing in this much, dad is bringing in this much, brother's bringing in nothing, mom is bringing in nothing. It looks like we don't have enough money for stuff, so like I'm paying for most of the stuff here. Like, what do y'all think about that? And then this is what I'm willing to do, but I can't do it myself. Or let's talk about that. Are y'all expecting me to essentially financially support? This is where you turn to your brother, right, who's the video game addict, and you ask him, like, what's your plan? Are you expecting me to, I just want to be clear. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just asking, what are you expecting from me? Ask your family, what are y'all expecting from me? Are y'all expecting me to continue to financially support this family? And if something needs to be paid for, I need to know whether that's a burden that's on my shoulders or that's something we're sharing. And this is where people are going to feel guilty. They'll start to make excuses. Like your brother will be like, yeah, I'll get around to it. And so then this is where I think now we get to some of the hard questions. So you turn to your mom and you can say, she's like, I'm sick. What can you do? Because I'm struggling. Is there anything you can do to help me? And if she says, no, I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do to help you. You can say, well, what about filling out paperwork to get on disability? Well, I can't do that because I'm sick. I mean, I think you can fill out paperwork. So let's just understand, you can't fill out paperwork. And the result of that is that I have to spend 8 hours a week working additionally because you can't fill out forms. I just want to make sure that we're like clear that that's what's going on. You can even turn to your dad or your brother and ask them, is that what y'all are seeing here? And then dad or brother will say, okay, like you can't blame her for that. She's sick. Okay. So it looks like mom isn't going to contribute at all. What about her expenses? Is there anything we can cut back on expenses? What do y'all think about expenses? So you've got to just talk to people about the expectations, lay it out. This is what we spend. This is what we get. Like, what's the system here? Let's call it what it is. As judgment-free as you can. Chances are there's going to be a lot of guilt on their end. So you're going to see all kinds of weird things, like people will stop showing up to the conversation and things like that. All kinds of stuff can happen. And that's where you got to talk to them and you can say, look, we need to talk about finances. I don't know how else to say this. Like, how are y'all expecting this to work? Now, you have to have these kinds of conversations, budgeting things out, asking people for their opinions about what they can contribute. Your brother's like, okay, I'll start college like next year. Okay, so like, what are you going to do in the meantime? Are you going to play video games all day? He's like, fine, I'll do whatever you want. I want to know what to expect from you. So don't fall into the trap. They're going to try to trap you this way. They're going to be like, I'll do whatever you want. Fine, tell us what to do. We'll do it. Anything to stop the conversation. Don't fall into the trap. Because if you tell them to do something, they're not going to do it, especially if you're not willing to induce consequences. What they want to avoid is the conversation, and that's exactly what you need to create. You need to create this frame of the conversation and then don't provide solutions. Do as best as you can to sit in that vacuum and pull the solutions out of them. Ask your brother, just tell me what you're willing to do. And then your brother's like, fine, I'll clean the kitchen. Then you're going to say, okay, what happens if you don't? And you're like, why? You want to punish me? No, I'm asking you, like, what's the accountability? So you can't provide answers to your family, but you have to force the conversation. And you create a vacuum where all of y'all are working on this together. You're not the saint. You're not the one with all the answers. They need to come up with the answers themselves, and you're going to do your best to force the conversation. So the goal here is that you cannot, I don't know how to say this, you cannot lift up your family by yourself. And what I see in situations like this is like people are trying to lift up the whole family. I'm trying to get my mom to do stuff. I'm trying to get my brother to do stuff. I'm trying to get my dad to do stuff. And not only are they not listening to you, they're actively sabotaging your efforts. Not intentionally, but there's no responsibility. And then the less responsibility they take, the more you put on your shoulders. And the more responsibility you put on your shoulders, the more AFK they become. Right? Because like if the internet modem breaks, your brother who's like addicted to video games, like he doesn't have to worry about getting it fixed or paying for it to be fixed because you're going to pay for it to be fixed. Your dad who spends all day watching conspiracy theories, if he doesn't have the internet, then like, how's he going to watch conspiracy? Oh, you'll take care of that. And so the goal here is to have shared responsibility as a family. And even before we get that far, this is what's really hard about this, is these conversations have to happen slowly and consistently, where everyone wants to jump to solutions and start making changes. For 1 month, no changes. Just talk. And then what you'll notice is as you have the conversations over and over and over again, a certain energy will be pent up. And then you pick a small thing. You can say, okay, you're going to clean the kitchen. If you're not cleaning the kitchen, what's the consequence? You're going to ask your brother. You're not going to impose the consequence. You ask him. right? So then if he's like, I don't know, what do you think? You'd say, okay, I think it's really simple. We can just shut off internet access or take the power cord away from your PC until things are cleaned. What do you think about that? He's going to hate it. But you'll get him into a corner. And then you can say, okay, when I do this, when I shut off your internet access or when I take away your power cord, what are you going to do or say? Ask him ahead of time. Right? So you have to get people to voice their own consequences, which then you as the leader may have to impose. And you want to ask them ahead of time when you impose the consequences. What are you going to do? Are you giving me permission to do this? Applies for your whole family, right? And you should be held, they're going to get angry at you. They're going to try to hold you accountable. Well, what are you going to do? And if you want to be straight with it, you can say, I will continue making it so that we aren't homeless. That's what I'm willing to contribute. If you really want to, I'm going to give us a roof over our heads. And if they're like, that's not enough, you can say like, okay, well, maybe I can leave then. I'm going to go ahead and move out. Good luck. So that's where you've got to be careful. You don't want to make those kinds of threats unless you're willing to follow up with them, which it's not really a threat. It's a boundary. And that's the kind of thing where if you're not emotionally ready to do that, don't do that. The right way is to say, okay, like if I'm not accountable, then this is what I'm willing to sacrifice. You can play that game, right? It's okay. Like you have limits that you want to eat healthier, right? So you can get your family to help you do that. So that's number one. I know it's a big number one, but it's essentially we have to have a conversation with our parents because you cannot lift up a family all by yourself. You absolutely need their help. They have to take some amount of shared responsibility. How do you do that? By framing a conversation about, okay, like what are we doing as a family? Like where's this ship headed? Let's all sit down and at least think about it and decide, are we okay with this or are we not okay with this? And you use the energy of their dissatisfaction to fuel whatever small steps you can. Right? You ask them, what are you unhappy with about the family? What are you unhappy with about our direction? What are you unhappy with about yourself? And if your brother volunteers, I'm unhappy being overweight, then you can say, okay, what do we as a family want to do to help him with that? How can we help you? It's not about power. It's not about punishment. It's not about independence. It's like you love your family. You care about your family. You all have shared problems and you need to work on them. Mom is sick and can't do her paperwork. Well, can you help mom do the paperwork? What is the value of y'all sitting down and doing the paperwork? It turns out to be, let's say, $500 a month. Could we use $500 a month? If you're telling me that you can't do that and what it's costing us is $6,000 a year, if this is not worth $6,000 a year to you to figure it out, that's fine. I guess there's nothing we can do about it. And they're going to say, oh, I don't know how to do it. And you can say, well, I don't know how to do it either. I've never done this before. Mom is like, I don't know how to do it. It's confusing. That's where you turn to the family and you ask, okay, what is this? Is it worth $6,000 a year for us to figure this out? What do y'all think? And then they're going to be like, well, yeah, obviously. It's like, okay, so then the two of y'all figure it out. Why don't y'all get started? Let's see how far we can get. And then next week when we meet, we can talk a little bit about what kind of obstacles you're running into and maybe Dad and I can help. Has to be shared responsibility. Second thing to do if you're in this situation. Explore your own emotions. So this is really, really, really important. So if you say, I'm not willing to abandon my family because I don't want my mom, I'm okay kind of abandoning my dad, but it's like I don't want my mom to be homeless. This is really tough, but I would encourage you to really explore where is the line between duty and where is guilt motivating your action. So the two are very closely tied together. Guilt and duty, right? When I don't do my duty, I feel guilty. But especially in a situation where we know there's emotional manipulation going on, you have to be very careful about guilt. And people may ask, okay, how do I tell the difference between healthy duty and unhealthy guilt? And there's one really key thing. That has to do, you shouldn't feel guilty for anything that is not in your power. The end of it. So should you feel guilty for not doing your duty? Absolutely. But what is the extent of your duty? How do we draw the boundaries around your duty? Your duty is what you can do. Right? It's not my duty. It's a ridiculous duty to fix the earth and solve climate change, let's say. But what I can do is not litter. So I can feel guilty. Emotions will irrational by nature. So I can feel guilty about all kinds of stuff. But the question is, what's truly in my power? And that's what you should really focus on. That's how you figure out, okay, can I force my brother to stop playing video games? Can I force him to stop eating? If the answer is no, or I'm unwilling to, if I'm unwilling to, and then that's my fault, I can feel guilty for that I'm not willing to use my power. That's fine. You can feel guilty about that. But be very, very careful. Explore your guilt and really ask yourself, what am I willing to do? What can I truly control in this situation? Now, here's the other thing, is as you do that exploration and as you try number one, which is sitting down with your family and trying to create a system of shared responsibility, something could happen, very reasonable, which is that you will fail spectacularly. Because here I am telling you how to do things, but to be honest, with families like this, it takes years of professional experience to be able to navigate these issues with families. I say this as a professional who does this with families that are stuck. And it's like sitting down with them and trying to get them to figure out. The chances of you succeeding as an amateur who's watching this thing once are very low. And yet that's where we have to start. There's a certain amount of practice. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but it is the right move. So then the question becomes, okay, so like then what, right? So now we're going to talk a little bit about like what you can kind of do in this situation if it doesn't work. Dr. K says, okay, sit down with them 1 hour a week and talk about these kinds of things and talk about shared responsibility and accountability and stuff like that. That's great, but they don't even show up. Now what do I do? And as you try these kinds of things and your family puts in more and more and more roadblocks, you will begin to see that I can't actually fix this for them. You will begin to see the futility of your efforts. You will begin to see that I can only do so much. And I can't carry my family to success. They have to want to do something too. As you come to that realization, do not push it away, because that is ultimately how you are going to conquer the guilt. And conquering the guilt is going to be very, very important. And once you start to walk that road, then you can start to really think about, okay, what kind of limits am I willing to set? What kind of boundaries am I willing to enforce? Because in trying to enforce a boundary when your family knows how to make you feel guilty is an exercise in futility. Not only is it an exercise in futility, it's actually harmful. It's better that you do nothing at all. And then you may ask, wait, hold on a second. That's crazy. Why would it be worse for me to try to set a boundary and fail as opposed to, should I even try? No. Here's why. When you set a boundary and it is not enforced, what are you actually teaching your family? What are you actually reinforcing? You're reinforcing the concept that your boundaries can be ignored. You're teaching them the lesson that they don't have to listen to you. And this is a huge problem that a lot of people get into, is that they'll arbitrarily start setting boundaries. They'll be like, if you don't do this, I'm not going to pay for groceries. And then when time comes around and they're like, I'm hungry and I have nothing to eat, the guilt gets better of you. You buy the groceries anyway because you're not going to let your mom starve. That's ridiculous. She spent her last money on cigarettes. I'm not going to let her starve. And so what is your mom actually learning? She's learning, oh, guilt is a useful tool to get what I want. You're actually reinforcing manipulation. You're teaching her how to be more manipulative because the only thing that works is guilting you. And then you get this situation where you're being guilted constantly by your family because you try to set a boundary and what you actually reinforce is that when they guilt you, they get what they want. So it's best not to set the boundary at all. Shocking. So be prepared for whatever kind of stick you want to enforce. Is it going to be money? Like you have to, internally, you've got to decide what you're willing to do and what you're not willing to do. People on the internet will tell you, oh, just do this. Don't pay for it. If she buys cigarettes, she doesn't get to eat. That's not your mom who's coughing while you're eating a cheeseburger that you picked up on the way home. And your mom is looking at you because she hasn't eaten in 24 hours. The people on the internet don't have to deal with that. So you've got to figure out what are you willing to enforce. And you may decide, this is very healthy, that you're not willing to enforce much. That's just not who you are or how you operate, which is totally fine. But as you try to go down this path, what you will discover, and this is what's kind of challenging, is that one of two things will happen. Either they'll get on board, they'll accept some shared responsibility, and your life will start moving in the right direction. Fantastic. Or they won't. And then what can happen is I hope you are able to be more at peace about leaving them. Because ultimately, I think that's where things probably should go. Right? You can keep on rolling the dice until mom passes away or brother randomly gets his crap together. But at some point, I think this is the key thing, is like, we don't want to abandon our family. Right? We don't want to give up on them. There's a huge difference. If you feel guilty for abandoning your family, there is one way to deal with that guilt 100% and abandon them anyway. The way to do that is to try everything that you can do. So that when you leave the home, you can leave knowing that I tried for 2 years to get these people to clean the fucking kitchen. And they would not even do that much. I tried so hard. I tried everything in my power to try to move my family in the right direction, and they just turned me down at every turn. And then you can leave and you can feel okay about it. You can be sad. You can be upset. And this is where we've got to be really careful, because shared responsibility means shared responsibility. Because if your mom ends up homeless, whose fault is that? You think, oh, it's mine. It's partially yours. But she wouldn't be homeless if she had filled out paperwork. She wouldn't be homeless if your dad decided to start working. She wouldn't be homeless if your brother helped out by getting some job. Why are you accepting all the responsibility? Because they give it to you and you take it. So the core of the problem here is that as our family gives us more responsibility and we take it, paradoxically, we become more powerless. Because they give you the responsibility, but they don't give you the power. They won't actually listen to what you say. They won't let you restrict how many cigarettes she buys, but they will absolutely make you responsible for being able to afford food when your mom buys too many cigarettes. So power and responsibility have to go hand in hand. And as you give your family the fairest possible shot you can, as you learn how to talk to them and give them every opportunity, and if they fail you time and time and time and time again, we move on to point number 3, which is that unfortunately, you probably have to go. And you say, but they will be homeless. Well, it's kind of interesting, right? Because as long as you're protecting them from homeless, they don't have to get their shit together. That's the other problem, is that by supporting all this bad behavior, you're actually allowing them to not take responsibility. And you'd be surprised at what human beings are capable of when they're given responsibility. You're supporting them, right? If you move out of the house, there's a decent chance your younger brother will actually step up. There's a decent chance that after a long time, as you have these conversations with mom, you can say, look, at some point, I'm not going to be able to do this anymore. So if you want to fill out that paperwork, I think that would be a really good idea. It'll help out the family a lot. It'll help me out a lot. If you're unwilling to do it, I can't do it. What do you mean you can't do it? What are the steps you've tried? I don't know where to start. How do you figure out where you start? Right? You've got to be like break it down into steps. She may not know how to do it. So what do we do when we don't know something? How do we approach that? I don't know how to do it either. She's like, I need your help. I've never done it before. How are you imagining that I'm going to figure it out? Because I've never done it before. Well, you're good at figuring things out. Yeah, and why aren't you good at figuring things out? I don't know. It's confusing. I think maybe the reason you're not good at figuring things out is because anytime you struggle with something, you dump it on me. And then I learn how to figure it out because someone's got to. And then the more that you leave me to figure things out, the better I get at it and the less of it you do. This isn't fair to me. You need to start taking some responsibility. Tell me whatever you can figure out, and younger brother, can you help? Ask for help. And if none of that crap works, we get to point number 3, which is it's really hard to understand this when you're in this situation. But you have a life after them. So easy to forget. It's not about being a good son or a bad son or doing your duty or whatever. Your mom has a few years left to live. Your dad after that will be whatever. Your brother after that will be whatever. And so the question is, you're 26 years old right now. When you're 28, when you're 29, when you're 30, what then? You have a life after them. So the question is, what do you want to put in place for that? Are you going to just put your life on hold, not learn anything about yourself and get drowned and not build up? You know, this person wants to like go to concerts and they want to meet friends and it's hard for them to date. Like, let's say that your mom lives for another 5 years, because we don't want her to pass away by any means. And now you're 31 and you haven't dated for a decade. Then what? This is the other thing to understand, is that it's fine to make sacrifices for your family. Like, I'm a huge fan of that in theory. Just understand what you're doing and where it's going, right? So this is my way of sitting down with you and asking you, let's think about this. Think for a second. What is this doing to your life? And then you could say, well, it's like sacrificing my life, so that's a good thing, right? Sacrificing your life for the sake of your family is only a good thing if it actually helps them. Sacrificing your life to keep them barely afloat while they continue to engage in unhealthy behavior and you enable their negativity, and then you end up drowning with them. You can jump onto a drowning boat and start bailing the water, but the point of jumping onto a drowning boat and bailing water is if everyone's bailing and you can save the boat. Jumping on just to drown with them is not worth it. Should you sacrifice your life for the sake of another? Yes, absolutely. But only if it's worth it. And this is what you'll learn as you try to help them, is you'll see whether they're willing to accept the help or not, whether they're willing to do their part. Because I hate to break it to you, but you cannot fix a life that is not yours. Just can't do it. Impossible. They have to take some responsibility. So at the end of the day, in many of these situations, I do think the right move is moving out. But we can't jump straight to moving out because that's abandonment. You got to give it everything you can. And once you give it everything that you can, then you'll start to realize internally, this is just not going to work. I can stay, but it's not worth it. It doesn't actually help them. And that's a conversation that you have with them as well, right? This is not the stick. If that doesn't feel right to you, like I'm going to threaten with moving out and then y'all are going to be homeless. No, what you can say is, look, for 3 months, I've been trying to get y'all to sit down and talk about this stuff and give direction to our life because we're drowning here. We're in a financially desperate situation. People are sick. This guy's 300 pounds. I'm 250 pounds. We're barely making ends meet. I can't save anything, even though I'm working my ass off. And for 3 months, I've tried to get all four of us, in a room for 1 hour a week. And we can't even do that much. I just want to let y'all know I'm going to start looking at other places to move out. It'll probably take me a couple months. I'm going to start looking for jobs here because I can't fix this family on my own. I just can't do it. And they can say, okay, but tell us what you want us to do. And this is where I'm going to teach y'all some techniques. Turn it around them. I've been saying what I want y'all to do. What have y'all heard? I've been saying it for the last 3 months. Don't answer the question then. Ask them to answer it. I don't know. Tell us now. And then you say, this is the crux of the problem. Is for months and months and months, I've been speaking and no one's been listening. And that's why I'm leaving. No, tell us. I promise we'll do something. Okay, so here's what I want you to do. Over the course of the next week, I want someone in this household to take responsibility for getting all 4 of us in a room for 1 hour together. Does that mean that you're not going to leave? No, I may still leave. I'm telling y'all that I've been trying this. It's not working. But if other people start taking responsibility, if things start moving in the right direction, I may consider staying. Let them take the responsibility. And then it's up to them. Right? They're like, oh, shit. And if they decide to get together, and then you're going to leave it to them, say, okay, let's try this one more time. But you yourself should not change your behavior. And even if they start doing everything right, and you find a job and you have an opportunity to move out, that's where things become really tricky. Because if you decide to sacrifice yourself for their sake, you could see now that the threat is gone, all of the bad behaviors will return. So as best as you can, I think the right thing to do is even move out then. Say, hey, I'm really happy that y'all are putting your life together. I'm still moving out because y'all just started this. If I take that off the table, it seems like what really motivated y'all is the fear of me moving out. So once that fear goes away, I'm afraid that all the bad behaviors will return. No, they won't. Okay, great. So I'm going to move out. Let's see if y'all can stay on top of this stuff. I'm happy to send some money from time to time to help y'all pay for expenses. So it's hard. Having a family that doesn't do their fair share. And we love our family, right? So we talk about how I'm drowning trying to take care of my family. And when we share our troubles with the internet tells us, abandon them. Easy for them to say. They're not the ones doing the abandoning. Many of them actually have, right? They say, that's what I had to do, and it worked out great for me. And so I think that sometimes moving on from your family is the right move because you can't make them do anything. But if you're feeling guilty and feel like you can't abandon them, I think you should make every effort to put them on the right path. And then if you do decide to leave, you can do so with a clear conscience because you gave it 18 months of dedicated effort. And not only did they not help, they threw up whatever roadblocks they could. And so this is not a solvable problem. And so is sacrificing yourself for the sake of your family worth it? Only if it helps them. Otherwise, it's just stupid. Questions? So Tony Grondel is asking, I feel like everyone else around me is drowning. Friends, family, I'm highly empathetic and it's starting to affect me. How do I disconnect from it? So there are a couple of things to remember. The first is that if you're a highly empathic person, the simplest way to control what comes into you is through your indriyas or your sense organs. So there's stuff about this in the current guide that's coming out now in 7 days, has a lot of stuff about the indriyas. But it's just to realize that if you're empathetic and you're around people, that you're going to do some of that absorption. So that's one thing to understand. Second thing to understand is that there are some techniques. So generally speaking, like I think Nadi Shuddhi or cleansing pranayams can be really good for like processing negative emotions, as well as Manipura chakra practices. That's not really scientifically valid, by the way. But in my experience, both as a clinician and as a meditation teacher, I think those help. But at the end of it, like, disconnecting starts with the sense organs. So if you're still spending time with these people, you need to be a little bit intentional about that. What's the right amount of time that I can handle? So Amit Fassiam is asking, going by the same vein of what can you do to improve your life when others are sabotaging you? What advice would you give to people with health issues or disabilities and without external support systems that are trapped in abusive situations and want to leave, but are financially dependent on the person they're trapped with? So that's a really challenging situation, unfortunately far too common. So I'd say 3 things. The first thing is that if the situation is that you're financially trapped by an abusive person, the goal is to get financially not trapped, right? It's sort of like, what advice would you give to someone who's starving? I'd say eat. Now, this is where things get really tricky because a lot of people will say like, well, I can't eat, right? If I could eat, I would. Obviously, duh. If I could become financially independent, I would. And that's where it's unfortunate, but what I've seen time and time and again by people who are trapped in abusive situations is that the abuser makes you think that you cannot be independent. That's their abuse tactic 101, is make people feel like they're trapped. So oftentimes what you'll find is that people are not nearly as trapped as they think they are, which is staggering, right? You're like, of course I'm trapped. I'm disabled. There are support systems for disabled people with disabilities. There's subsidized housing. There's all kinds of stuff out there. But the whole point by the abuser is that they've trained you to think that you're completely powerless. So you have to be a little bit critical of that and see what kind of financial opportunities are available. I'm not saying they are necessarily, but it's worth revisiting the issue before accepting the conclusion, is what I'm saying. Second thing is, as you're working that stuff, you have to understand that a certain amount of the effect of abuse is your response to it. So there may be some things that you can do or say, but a lot of it is going to be like internal strength. So that's where like even meditative practices or things like that can like help in terms of like purifying and like letting things go and stuff like that. I mean, it's challenging. You can also look at doctrines like Stoicism and things like that to try to resist the impact of it, but it's really tough. The other thing that I would say very concretely is even if you don't know what to do and you feel like you're stuck in an abusive situation, there may be other people out there who are willing to help you. It's just about getting access to those. And so how do you do that? That's where it's like kind of depends on where you live and what's going on and stuff like that. But oftentimes there are resources, right? So mental health centers, things like that. Social workers can help you find housing, help you apply for grants and get disability payments and all that kind of stuff. So there are resources out there depending on where you live and what your situation is that people may be able to help you figure it out. So I'd say the last thing is ask for help. Maybe not to your abuser, but to someone else. So 900 IQ Thanos play is saying, be prepared for extinction bursts when you start enforcing boundaries and stop enabling bad behavior. Great point. So as you have these kinds of conversations, you're going to see all kinds of problems arise with your family. They're going to start guilt tripping you. They'll start getting sick. They'll throw temper tantrums. And that's where, remember, that's why the tightrope is so narrow, because we're not going to make them do stuff. We're not going to actually enforce boundaries on them. We're going to ask them to do it themselves. That's what's so challenging, is it's the long game, right? 6 weeks. It's not, hey, this is what everyone needs to do. What do you think you can do better? What do you think I can do better? What do you think mom can do better? Mom, what do you think about that? Here's what I heard and here's what I'm trying to do. What are y'all willing to do? It's not about what you can do. It's not about what I'm going to make you do. It's what are you willing to do? So that's where like you can try to minimize those kinds of things, but it's going to be challenging for your family. You can even point out to them, look, we've got to figure this out. I don't know what else to do. I have certain ideas, but it's not like I'm the arbiter of truth here. So I'd love to have a discussion, and hopefully we can figure out together as a family how to like improve our situation. And asking them, it's lots of questions. What do you think is wrong with our situation? What do you think could be better? Does that make sense? So Irreverent Fox, what if the parents' experience of being unable to find a decent job makes them think they will never find a new job at all? That's something where you can empathize, right? And then the question sort of becomes, what's the cost? This is eventually what you want to get to. What's the cost of looking for a new job? Even if you're not going to find it, what's the cost? Oh, you're going to watch fewer hours watching daytime TV or conspiracy theories on YouTube. Like, I understand that it's been hard. Maybe we can try to help you. It's been really hard. I hear it. At the same time, I don't know. So if you're not going to find a job, how do we make ends meet? What's your solution? Right? So it's not disputing, trying to convince them that they can find a job. It's like, okay, I'm going to accept your premise, then what? So if they're like, oh, well, like, I guess we're going to have to make more money. It's like, well, there's another option, right? Is if you're not bringing in money, we can see where we can cut back on expenses. Right? Because if we want to be able to afford junk food, which by the way, junk food is expensive, we probably need to be bringing in more money. So one of those two have to go as I see it. Like, this is just the math. Right? This is how much we bring in. This is how much. And you say you're not willing to, or it's a waste of your time. And then you can set similar limits as well. Okay, that's fine. So I'm not willing to spend more than this much as a family contribution to like stuff in the household. So I'm going to pay this much rent and I'm going to pay this much for food. I expect other people to lift as well. Mocambo is asking, what if you're on the tail end of this and you're already 30? So ain't no time but the present, Mocambo. It can be hard. So the older you get, in some ways, the more difficult it's going to be because your family will have expected you to enable their bad behavior for 8 years versus 5 years. And there's not really that big of a difference, right? So you can still have these conversations. You can take a leadership role, but if you're not willing to exercise your power, you can be a leader who doesn't use power. You're just going to facilitate conversations. So you still, I mean, I'd say start ASAP, right? And in 1 month, hopefully you've had 4 conversations without any kind of, and this is like, we're making this sound very doom and gloom. The reality of it is that a lot of times families will respond really well to this, right? That's why I'm telling y'all to do this, because this works. So I've seen that when you have the conversation in the right way and you keep at it, like, because no one likes a dirty kitchen. It's just, there's never even been like, I don't know how to say this, some families don't even like conceptualize responsibility. That responsibility is something that must be discussed and divided. They're just kind of like, because no one ever taught them, right? It's just how things were at home. You know, mom always cleaned the kitchen, right? Because we're thinking about your parents' parents or grandparents. And now that mom is sick and no one can clean the kitchen, it's like, I guess the kitchen doesn't get cleaned. So Sudarshan 817 is saying, what if you tell them something and it bothers them so much they can't wait for a week and they create havoc? Let them create havoc. And then meet them next week and talk about it. Don't focus on the havoc, just focus on, okay, so like, you know, because they're not going to realize they're creating havoc. They don't understand their displaced emotions, and trying to convince them that is a waste of your time. It's just next week, what we're going to demonstrate is consistency. What we're going to demonstrate, so I'll give you, when I hear that question, it's such a great question, because families create, when families start throwing temper tantrums, they create reactive dynamics. So why do family members throw temper tantrums? Let's say we're talking about financial responsibility and groceries, and I feel bad. I'm like, oh shit, they're coming after me, subconsciously, right? So I start creating havoc. I start doing all this weird, emotionally manipulative, passive-aggressive, throwing a temper tantrum. And then someone's asking, okay, how do we react to that? The answer is you don't. Why do they do that? Because people react to it. When you react to it, you're no longer talking about financial responsibilities. Now you're blaming them for taking a dump in the living room. And then you all fight about that. But how have they succeeded? Because we're not talking about money anymore. And that's why people do emotionally manipulative, crazy shit. Because they direct the conversation. It's like a trump card, right? It's like God mode. It's like, I'm going to take a dump in the living room. We forget that conversation you were having because now we're going to fight over this. So don't react to it. Don't lose sight of the conversation. That's the right way to handle it. You know, you can address it if you want to, but then when next week comes around, hey, let's all sit down and talk about finances. And then what'll happen is, as long as you don't let their reactions shape your behavior, then you will see an extinguishing of the behavior. Because now taking a dump in the living room doesn't get me what I wanted, which is to avoid the finance conversation. When it stops working, people will stop doing it. But for you, it's going to be an absolute mess of a month. Great question. Okay, so a lot of good questions. So Pop in Buckets is saying, what is the general approach on measuring improvement, as it can be hard to grade? That's a great question. That's why you ask them, right? So you don't institute in an authoritarian manner what the measurement systems are. What you do is ask them, okay, what are we going to try to do? Like, what are we focusing on? Clean kitchen. What does clean kitchen mean? Who's responsible for it? When are we going to check it? You have to get into all these details. Does it mean empty sink, empty dishwasher? Does it mean trash is taken out? What is it? Does it mean recycling isn't overflowing? Like, what does it mean? And who's responsible for each of those things? So let your family help in the measurement system instead of you passing something down. You'll get a way higher compliance rate if you do that. Fuzzy Sig is saying narcissists, they agree, but don't follow the rule set. That's why you have to have a preemptive conversation about what happens when someone doesn't follow the rules. What are the consequences? And so since that's been predetermined, you enforce whatever it is. And then the narcissist will be hurt. But you're not considering that this is an exceptional circumstance in my situation. You're like, yeah, you're right. This is what we said. So now I have a question for you, narcissist. Are we allowed to use excuses to avoid the consequences of the system? Ask them. Are we allowed to, are we sticking with stuff or are we letting people off? You tell me, what are we going to do? Are you going to do this thing or not? No, I can't because of this. Okay, totally understand. Not your fault. It's too much for you to handle. And I just want everyone else to know as well that if y'all are feeling overwhelmed, you don't have to do it either, right? Because that's what we're setting an equal standard for everyone, right? Well, it's different for you because I'm sick and you're not. I totally understand. But if I start to feel sick, then, I get a pass too, right? I just want to know, are we sticking to the system or are we not sticking to the system? Well, it's different for you. Oh, I see. Okay, so now the system that we're instituting, don't resist, right? The system that we're instituting is that you don't have to stick with it because you're sick. But since I'm not sick, I'm held accountable and you're not. Well, obviously, yeah. Okay, just want to make sure I understand that. What about the other two? Right? What about dad and brother? Are they held? So the three of us are accountable and you're not accountable. Call it what it is. Don't blame them for it. Just say, I want to understand. So the thing about narcissists is that oftentimes they don't want to get blamed when they do something. And so what we're going to try to do is like not blame them, right? Oh, I understand you're sick. So going forward, what should we expect from you? If you say you're going to do something, should we assume that you're not doing it? Should we take you off the responsibility list? Like, how would you like to handle the situation? And what about us? How should we handle the situation? Just lay it out, and whatever they say, run with it. And what happens with a narcissist is whenever you stop disagreeing with them, but keep track of everything they say and you put it back to them, it becomes increasingly ludicrous. Okay, so you don't have to do anything when you're feeling sick. I have to do stuff. I have to clean. I have to do this. I have to do this. I have to do this. That's what you said, right? No, that's not what I said. Okay, cool. Because that sounds kind of ridiculous. Tell me, please explain again. What do you think we should do? And then they said those 6 things. And then when you're like, that's what you said, right? They're like, no, of course not. And then they cut it down to 4. Right? And then you're like, okay, so you're saying these 4 things. They're like, no, that sounds ridiculous. Okay, so you tell me which way is it? And then they cut it down to 3. They're like, yeah, okay. And now we moved from 6 to 3. And how did we do that? We didn't call the narcissist a narcissist. We just agreed with them. And they start cutting back on their own. And why does that happen? It's because as we agree with them, as we empathize with them, as we don't blame them, their insecurity lowers. They don't feel as targeted. And as they feel, if they don't need to be defensive, then the narcissistic defense mechanism comes down and they can see things more rationally. Make sense? Okay. So my question is, so Arhanka is asking, my question is, this seems like a situation where the family members aren't toxic in and of themselves, but the situation is more toxic and has grown more so. Are there not situations where the people themselves are toxic to the degree that it is detrimental emotionally and mentally to even try to sort out the situation? How would you go about that? So first of all, really good observation that remember that toxicity within in family groups is oftentimes like grown wildly. It's not like it's not like cultivated, right? It's like the natural consequence of people not knowing how to share responsibility. So that's where we can say, oh, this person is toxic. But remember that even things like narcissism is a relational aspect of personality. Narcissism can't exist on its own. It is a consequence of interpersonal relations. And so something else stimulated and supported the narcissism to grow. So this is important to understand, that when your family is like in a bad situation, like chances are it's everyone's fault to some degree, right? And what you learned are things like how to enable. What you learned is like how to respond to emotions and be like emotionally manipulated. But here's the thing. If you look at a family unit where a bunch of people use emotional manipulation, you still get everyone getting their needs met. Does that make sense? Like, it's a toxic way of doing so, but it kind of works. That's why families behave the way that they do. So that's where the goal is like, let's take shared responsibility, right? We're all going to do our part. And everyone will assume that the part they have is greater than everyone else's. That's just normal. Now, sometimes what you'll do is you'll get one bad apple. And that's where things get tricky. I mean, we can do a whole other lecture about that, but dealing with a bad apple, in short, you've got two options. You can't deal with a bad apple unless it's uniform. So what we tend to see with personality disordered people, one personality disordered person in a family of like normal people, is that unless everyone sets the same limit, the person will find the one chink in the armor and like use that person to create problems everywhere else. So everyone has to set the same limit, otherwise it's not going to be worthwhile. That's why what a lot of people will end up doing is leave the family unit, right? They'll go like low contact with my family. I still talk to my brother from time to time, but I don't go to Thanksgiving and stuff like that. And then your brother is still suffering because he goes to Thanksgiving, but that's kind of on him. So either you remove yourself from the family situation, you can still maintain relationships with individual family members, or the whole family has to come together and set common boundaries on the person who's toxic. When can it be considered too selfish to move on beyond family? That's not for me to say, right? That's up to you. So my personal compass is that you should do what you can, but that it should be shared responsibility. And furthermore, there's no use in expending effort if you're not getting anything out of it. So I'm happy to make a sacrifice, but I'll make sacrifices that other people will benefit from, not sacrifices that other people will throw in my face. Okay. I'm trying to catch up on chat. So Coco G is saying, my relationship broke up because of my ex-family. Every old mental, she is Egyptian and she is also the provider of the family, but her family abused her. I'm not able to really follow, but it sounds unfortunate. So this is a great question. Biker JJ says, how do you go about if you're dealing with your family where people have difficulty standing up for themselves because dad always has the right answer? So I think that's where you have a conversation with dad and you this is tricky, but here's how you do it. You have a conversation either with your family or with dad about what makes you have the right answer. Just ask, right? So they may not be very open-minded about it. And like, so you can start by asking, okay, like, so dad, like, you're the dad, so you have the right answer. Can you help me understand how that works? I'm the parent. I've lived on this earth for longer than you have. Therefore, I know the right answer. You can ask, does that mean that you know the right answer about everything or just like some things? Like, what are the things that you know more than me about versus the things that you don't know more than me about? You can just start asking questions. And then another thing that you can do is ask them, so when you were growing up, what was the situation like in your household? Chances are, 95% chance, there was one parent who had all the right answers, right? And that was the answer, person who had the right answers. And so then you can ask your dad, when you were growing up and your dad had all the right answers, do you think your dad was right 100% of the time? So your dad is going to see that you're going to trap him there, so they're going to say no, they're not going to like it. But your point has been made. I'm not trying to trap you, Dad. I'm just genuinely asking, what was it like growing up with a dad like yours? And what's your relationship with him like now? Ask him, right? Because usually when people are my way, the highway, there's some kind of equilibrium, but there's not going to be warmth or understanding. Can you confide in your dad? Are you close to him? This is where your dad is going to say, like, we get by, right? And then you can turn to your dad and you can say, I don't want that kind of relationship with you 20 years from now. I don't want to just get by. I want us to be close. I want to be able to talk to you about anything. But the way that you're raising me makes me feel like not maintaining a relationship with you. What do you think about that? And that's where Dad says, I don't care if you want to maintain a relationship with me or not. You got to listen. And you're like, understood, Dad. And then if you feel comfortable with that, you can come back a couple days later and say, hey, Dad, just wanted to let you know, based on our last conversation, I'm curious, what do you think our relationship is going to look like 10 or 15 years from now? 5 years from now? I don't care what it looks like. You just have to listen. Heard you loud and clear, Dad. I understood very clearly that you do not care what our relationship looks like. Thank you very much for making that clear. It's helped me understand your behavior a lot better. And then they're going to blow up and you step away, but you've got your answer. And so then what you're going to do is over time, you're going to distance yourself. You're going to become financially independent. You're going to move out of the house. And then when Dad starts feeling lonely, you're going to sort of throw it back in his face, right? And you're going to say, Dad, you've made it very clear to me that you did not want a relationship. And then Dad is going to say, but I'm sorry. Okay. I'm not sure that I'm ready to forgive you. Even if I forgive you, it doesn't change the damage that you've done. They're like, what damage did I do? I want you to think about it and get back to me. So here's the thing. Sometimes when parents ask for forgiveness, especially if they're narcissistic or self-centered, they'll tell you, what do I need to do to make it up to you? And this is where you're going to say, that's not my responsibility. That's yours. It's your attitude that made the relationship this way. It's your job. It's not my job to figure out how to fix your fuck-ups. It's your job to figure that out. But I don't know what to do. Neither do I. I've never been a parent who has told their kid that they don't care about their relationship. I don't know how to fix this. But I don't know how to do that. Okay, so we'll see how hard you try. What do you want me to do? That's for you to figure out. Maybe go see a therapist. I'm not going to do that. It's like, okay, so I've made a suggestion. You made it clear to me that you don't want to listen to my suggestions, so I'm not going to make any others. You can figure it out. Parents, people don't talk like that to parents. Right? There's like even in the subtle ways, we don't realize that parents, when they ask you, what do I need to do to make it up to you? When someone screws with you, hurts you, and they ask you, what do I need to do to take responsibility? In asking you, they're giving up the responsibility. They're putting it on you. You tell me. Make the list. Tell me what to do. I'm going to check all the boxes, and then we're going to be square. Even in asking that question, they're absolving themselves of their responsibility. Get that? Subtle. And this is the thing. Like, no one teaches us how to, like, deal with these parents, right? All we learn is what they teach us, which is not to be reflective, which is not to ask questions, which is not to notice the interpersonal dynamics. Ratuta's asking, what do you want me to do? I can't go back in time? Yeah, so I don't understand. When damage has been done and you can't go back in time, what makes you think it's fixable? What, are you saying that it's not fixable? I'm saying I don't know how to fix it. If you care that much, you'll figure out a way. But I don't know how to. And it's like, I certainly don't know how to. To what extent are you willing to go to fix this problem? Like, I don't know. You're asking me for something impossible. And I say, this is exactly what the problem is. You didn't accept responsibility for what you were saying in the moment, and you're not accepting responsibility today. So I don't think this is going to be fixed because you're giving up on it. But I don't know what to do, so figure it out. I don't know how to figure it out. Figure out how to figure it out. I don't have the answers. What I want to see from you is to what extent you are willing to try to figure out and start to think in a way that you are already not thinking. Because the whole problem was that you refused to get out of your own head because you knew best. And now you're saying the same thing. You're saying, I know best and this is unfixable. Same thing, Dad. Does that make sense? Sorry for the confusion. I'll share my problem some other time. What if it's culture? Yeah, so there are all kinds of, great question, Kokoji. There are all kinds of cultural influences that change these conversations, right? So like I grew up in a culture where like I have to have conversations in a slightly different way, but they're very challenging as well. There are like all kinds of dynamics that are common in Indian households and stuff like that. So all this stuff has to be kind of like modified. So we have a pretty like Western-centric perspective here. But even what we're sort of trying to fight against is this idea of like independence and just abandon your family. Because a lot of people are not willing to do that. Western, Eastern, whatever. Drop a sub for the boys saying zero mercy, Dr. K. Yeah, I mean, sort of like sometimes you got to hold people accountable. Right? And sometimes you don't want to, you want to say things that can feel hurtful because that's your truth. But sometimes that's what it takes to get people to listen and hear you. Okay, so Snowball's chance is asking, how do you even level this up? Seems like you have to take on a high level with only one chance to get it right. So this is where like we have things in the HG community for y'all to practice this stuff. So at the top of the list is group coaching. So here's what group coaching will specifically teach you. A lot of times in conversation, we get wrapped up in something, right? And it's hard to keep track of the big picture. So once your dad says something like, I can't go into the past and make it right. What are you expecting me to do? Invent a time machine? They'll say something that will like get you emotionally riled up, right? Because they're trying to create a situation where they're like engaging you in a dynamic where the rules of the game is it's not my fault. So the second you start playing the rules of the game, you've lost. So how do you pay attention to the meta level conversation? How do you not get caught up in that? How do you become aware of what people are doing? And what's like the subtle behind the scenes interpersonal dynamics? Group coaching will teach you that. As you participate in group, I'll give you all an example. So y'all can even see this on Thursday's stream, where it's like, how do I know when to speak and when not to speak? How do I know when to monopolize time? And how do I know when to listen? How do I learn how to ask questions? How do I learn how to pay attention? These are the skills 101 that we learn. And we don't get caught up in things. That's another key thing about group is that like the facilitator is going to teach you, oh, we've been on this tangent for 30 minutes. By the way, let's keep track of the big picture. So keeping track of the big picture, for example, is a specific skill that we will teach coaches. Paying attention to participation, paying attention to dyads that form, conflict that forms, dealing with conflict. Sometimes in groups we'll get people who are on opposite ends of this political spectrum or play opposite video games where my game is better than your game. How do you have a conversation without people getting charged? How do you learn to listen? For people that are not interested in like that much of a commitment in terms of leveling up their skills, we have things on Discord like Ask a Coach, Social Sandbox. Those are also places that you can practice boundary setting, practice that kind of stuff. And what we tend to find in these situations is, especially like more longitudinally, like what you'll have in group, for example, is half the group will have family problems. And so we'll come in and we'll talk about it from week to week, right? Okay, this is what I'm going to try to say. How do you feel about it? Okay, this is how I feel about it. Okay, I didn't realize that I felt that way. And those feelings were were like controlling my behavior. Once you become aware of those feelings, you kind of handle those feelings externally. Now you're doing something amazing. You're going into a conversation emotionally calm. And once you go into a conversation emotionally calm, you're a completely different person. Oh, so narcissistic parent says, rules for thee, but not for me. How do you handle that? That's infuriating. And the second you fall into the fury, you antagonize them. As you antagonize them, things will get pulled into their kind of thing. You start yelling at them. When you start yelling at them, their narcissism, oh, I'm so persecuted. You give them exactly what they want, and they feel good. So how do you avoid that whole thing? You just, okay. So different rules for you and different rules for me. That feels kind of unfair to me. What do you think? No, it's not unfair because I'm different. Okay, I understand. I understand. You're different. You struggle with illness. So we're just in a situation where because of your illness, it's not your fault. Because of your illness, I'm going to have to work twice as much. I understand. I'm so sorry that things are that way. It must be really hard for you, right? You want to try to say that genuinely and stay calm. And then the narcissist is going to kind of, they're not going to like that. So how do you learn these things? You're going to talk about it in group. Someone else is going to be like, oh, I tried that. It helped me so much. Here's one thing that I did that really helped me. And then other people are going to be like, okay, cool. Like, let me try that. Let's see what happens. Let's practice what we're going to say with our narcissistic family members. How are you going to phrase it? How did it go? That's key. Yeah, so when Draco333 is saying hard to make it not sound sarcastic, that's exactly why you practice in group. So what you're going to learn in group is how to authentically empathize with people, right? So there's data that shows that EQ improves, the capacity for empathy improves when you do social relationships, and people's subjective experience of social relationships improves through group. So they socially level up. And that's like the big thing that we don't really think about, right? Like, so we all know that we struggle with social problems, but like, how do you actually fix them? And you can fix them. You can read a book. Like, you can read How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. It's a great book. You can watch YouTube videos. You can watch this stream. But, you know, you can only watch so many surfing videos. You can only learn so much about how to surf by watching other people surf. So at some point, you've got to practice. You've got to actually listen. You have to inquire. You have to learn how to ask questions. You have to learn how to empathize. And the problem is when it comes to like social stuff, we don't think about it like surfing, right? We don't think about it as like a skill that we can intentionally level up, but that's like literally what therapists do. We spend years training ourselves to listen and speak. And if people think, oh my God, like Dr. K is so amazing, like I don't think I'm not that different from your average therapist or psychiatrist. We're all taught these skills. That's the whole thing. So you don't need just Dr. K. You can actually work with a ton of people and they'll be able to help you too. It's about developing the right skill set and applying the right skill set. Okay? I'm not saying that I'm not exceptional out of some sense of false humility. I mean, literally. Like if you look at the minimum competence of a therapist, we all become trained at listening. That's what we do. right? And what we do on stream is more, I mean, it's more than the therapy training, right? So we don't diagnose or treat anything. But furthermore, it's like a lot of the Eastern perspective. So that's where like you can go to a meditation teacher and you can go to a therapist and you'll get a lot of what you would get from me. Okay. Who are we rating? Oh my God, it's almost 3 o'clock. GG's. So one other thing is that as we're kind of bouncing out, I understand that there's like a lot of discussion around gambling on Twitch right now. So this is something that if you guys like, I think we're gonna, I don't know the details, but you know, we can definitely talk about gambling addiction and sort of dig into this some. So we'll probably touch on it on Wednesday. No, so this is where, so people, I noticed that people are mentioning lots of specific streamers, and we're totally fine talking to people. In fact, I think that's great. So especially what I'd love to see more of on Twitch is, generally speaking, when like people get into beefs, right? It's like, it feels to me almost like ship warfare, where it's like, there's a broadside from my cannons, which I'm going to fling your way. And there's a broadside from your cannons, which you're going to fling my way. So we get like people, you know, like attacking each other. I'm not saying that people shouldn't be held accountable and that criticisms aren't valid. What I'm saying is the manner in which we try to communicate around conflict does not seem... I think it's productive in a particular way, but I think there's another element of productivity that we're missing out on. So I think that there's good stuff that comes out of communication that way. But like what I'd really love to see more in our community is like people kind of hashing stuff out. It doesn't mean that one person is right and one person is wrong, or sometimes it does mean that one person is right and one person is wrong. But even if you're someone who's right and someone else is someone who's wrong, there are healthier and unhealthier ways of communicating that. And I don't blame anyone for not doing this because no one's ever tried this way, right? We haven't really talked about it. But this is the kind of thing where I don't think it's like really about ambulance chasing and like, oh, like this person is like struggling, so let's go talk to them. We're here to support people who are struggling. So that's, I mean, it's really about like if there's some kind of conflict, you know, let's like get into a room and model more for everyone in our community. How can you have a discussion like this, right? So if you really believe that someone has a problem and you think they made a mistake, it's important. It's not like everyone's equal and one person made a mistake. You know, sometimes like one person really screwed up, but even then, like how do we engage with that person? So that's something, I mean, there's no way we can do that on Wednesday because I still don't understand what's going on. But in terms of like, you know, I understand that gambling is part of the discussion. So probably what we'll do on Wednesday is I'm going to look at a bunch of research over the next 48 hours on what we know about specifically how gambling addiction has changed with the internet. And we're going to approach it the way that we try to approach everything, which is just like we're going to try to educate people about what's going on. And not trying to throw any shade on any particular people or blaming anyone for anything. So please, please, please don't take it that way. And at some point, you know, if there's a good opportunity to have a more productive discussion, almost like from a conflict resolution standpoint, where you can like, you know, that's something that I think that the internet really needs and we need to practice and showcase. So. And who are you rating, though? Raid Bend Over. He's a small streamer who plays Dota in an interesting way. Okay, I'm seeing JMook 11. Okay. All right. All right, take care, everybody. We are going to raid JMook 11. We'll see y'all on Wednesday. Okay. All right. So I know that today was a little bit different, y'all, in terms of like, we went pretty deep into two topics. Especially with the family stuff, there's just too much detail that we had to go into. You can't, when it comes to problems of that size, you can't just like, here are the 5 tips, right? Like, so there are tips, but you really need to appreciate the whole scale of like, the problem with tips for like family discussions is that it doesn't account for all the possibilities. And so I know it's like kind of deep, but it sort of has to be if you really want to learn what to do about this. So hopefully that helps people. I understand that some people, it may not really apply to you, and I'm happy to hear that. Anyway, take care. We'll see you all on Wednesday.